Am I doing?
Yeah, no.
Well, that was a surreal moment for me. I want to welcome everyone. This is I'm used to being out there, so with the other folks that I worked with for a very long time. So I'd sort of gonna have to get used to sitting wherever this is in the chair spot, but I do appreciate all of the work. I just want to welcome everyone and the members as well. This is quite a group of folks who have come together to work on behalf of the citizens of the state and to work on the important transportation work that we have in front of us. So I just want to start off by, by thanking everyone for that. For the record, Frank Principe will be chairing this very important group and look forward to the conversations that we're going to have over the course of the next several months. We have a lot of work. I wanted to thank the governor and the Senate President and the Speaker of the House for asking me to serve in this capacity. By way of background, I'm a lifelong public servant, having worked at all levels of government for the last 30 years. In fact, this past session was my 33rd session, as my children like to remind me of that. So I think they're watching out there someplace. They didn't come down, but they were very interested since I torture them endlessly on this topic as we pass over bridges and other facilities. They have to hear things about it that they probably have no interest in. But I started my public service career in the Senate President's office with Mike Miller, and continued in local and state government work for the county executive in Baltimore County for Jim Smith back in the day before going to the Department of Transportation. My experience also included regional long-range transportation planning with the BMC and the BRTB. That somehow crept into my portfolio over time, along with Homeland Security and a couple of other odds and ends. So, but I really was captivated with transportation. And when the secretary gave me the opportunity in the second term of the O'Malley administration to join MDOT as the chief of staff, I jumped at the opportunity and certainly was a wonderful, wonderful run. As chairman of this commission, I hope to be serving as a bridge between the different levels of government and with all of our stakeholders to promote collaboration. I'm excited for this work ahead. It's been a while since we've had this conversation. For me, maybe for some of you at the table, this feels like deja vu. In 2013, as MDOT chief of staff, I worked with the General Assembly to pass that critical revenue package. Back then, the primary focus was on raising the necessary funding, but now this commission will look at an even greater and larger picture that's in front of us. As Governor Moore said last weekend to the local elected leaders at MACo, there are pressing challenges ahead. We can no longer rely on the status quo, and I truly believe that that is the case. The governor sees these challenges as opportunities for Marylanders to work together in partnership and to jumpstart the state's economy. Looking around this room and in speaking with the folks who have come together to work on this, I know that we also have a shared vision for this commission. Together, we will recommend how to prioritize the state's transportation projects so that we can achieve our shared vision of a balanced, equitable, and resilient transportation system that spurs economic growth and connects Marylanders to opportunities. We will also provide recommendations for sustainable transportation funding that will enable the state to deliver major programs and projects in the future. Most importantly, we will do this critical work together, shoulder to shoulder, leaning into this effort and asking the hard and challenging questions. Around this table, and I don't know if we have folks online or not. Not today. Okay, so I will take that out. Around the table and in this room, we have representatives from state and local government, including senior executives and legislative leaders. We are blessed to have influential members from our business and trade groups and nonprofits, along with our courageous advocates for transit, bike, pedestrian safety, and the environment. As we work over the next 18 months, we will serve with transparency. We will welcome and encourage robust public input. Our meetings are going to be live streamed, yes. And we have also made sure that the associated materials for these meetings are available to everyone. Transparency, partnership, and service are my hope and ambition for the work of this commission. In closing, I just wanted to say, shaping Maryland's future transportation system is a mission of great consequence, and your work is critical to that effort. To every member of this commission, I wanted to just take the opportunity to thank you in advance for your talent, devotion, and the precious time that you will put into this effort. I'm humbled to serve with you at your side, and I welcome your critical input as we lean into this important work. I would also like to take a moment to thank the staff members who will help guide us in our mission. From MDOT, we have Jacqueline Hartman, Tony Bridges, Joe McAndrews, Jave Show, and Caleb Weiss. From the Department of Legislative Services, Michelle Lambert, Steve McCullough, and Carrie Cook. It is my hope and desire that this commission stand as a testimony to how public service is done in a spirit and practice that fosters mutual respect and true collaboration. I am confident we will do our best as public servants and residents. We will do our best to serve the residents of Maryland and their families and neighbors and future generations. We will take the opportunity to go around the room to have brief introductions by the commission members. But before I do that, I wanted to invite Secretary Wiedefeld to discuss the governor's transportation vision and his thoughts on our path ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the committee, the commission members, obviously for the time and effort it's going to take to wrestle with some tough issues, to be quite frank. So it is a new day at the Department of Transportation. The Maryland Department of Transportation is committed to working in partnership and transparency with the communities we're here to serve. MDOT will deliver services and facilities to support the governor's goals of social equity, environmental protection, and sustainable communities. Most importantly, MDOT will build and maintain a transportation network that provides not just physical mobility, but economic mobility to lift all Marylanders and all communities. We made some progress in the short time we've been in office, but some of the toughest challenges lie ahead. We've begun to work to rebuild state government by investing in employees who do the critical work in our transportation system every day. And as you know, the number one goal of the department is safety. The safety of our employees and of the traveling public who use our facilities and services every day. MDOT is committed to Vision Zero goal, rapidly reducing roadway fatalities to zero by 2030. And I have charged my team to take a fresh look at our regulations, policies, and capital transportation program to ensure we're removing barriers and making investments in a safer multimodal transportation system. I've also directed my team to update and upgrade MDOT's 11-year-old Complete Streets policy, designing roadways to provide safe mobility options for all users. And I'm proud MDOT has joined U.S. Department of Transportation's National Roadway Safety Strategy as an ally in action in the national initiatives dedicated to ending deaths on our roadways. As we work to create a safe and sustainable transportation system for the future, Maryland must preserve the multi-billion-dollar investment we made in existing facilities. To that end, we must annually invest to maintain roadways and replace and rehabilitate our bridges. We need to replace aging rail vehicles at MTA and WMATA, as well as converting to zero-emission buses at both agencies. Keeping the shipping channels clear at the Port of Baltimore, and maintaining critical facilities at BWI Thurgood Marshall and Martin State airports. Our transportation network must also be resilient and include the necessary provisions to anticipate and mitigate the impacts of climate change, especially in the vulnerable flooding areas of the Eastern Shore. We're also investing in projects to support economic development. Just a few examples: improving the safety along I-81, the I-81 corridor in Western Maryland, I-95 and Belvedere Road interchange in Cecil County, I-495, I-95, I-495 at Medical Center Drive in Prince George's County, and I-795 and Dolefield Road in Baltimore County are just a few of the examples of projects that we need to improve access to planned growth and employment corridors. But economic access must extend beyond single occupancy drivers only. We must look at every project as a multimodal opportunity to benefit pedestrians, bicyclists, and make every connection we can to promote transit and ride sharing. We already are on the right path by expanding options and opportunities. For example, we are moving aggressively to complete the Purple Line project. And as you know, earlier this year, the governor revived the Red Line project in Baltimore. We are moving forward with the Southern Maryland Rapid Transit project. We have started discussions to expand the MARC train service into Delaware and Virginia. And we partnered with President Biden and Amtrak on the new Frederick Douglass Tunnel. We're also working with other state agencies, local jurisdictions, and the private sector to create inclusive economic opportunity by leveraging underutilized transit stations and turning them into unique community-focused, transit-oriented developments. Just last week, we partnered with Medco and issued 2 requests for proposals to study TOD opportunities. One study will examine opportunities along the MARC Penn Line, and the second study will look for innovative ideas to support investment around light rail and subway stations in the Baltimore region. And as just announced this week, we're moving ahead with seeking federal funding for the American Legion Bridge and looking through the lens of equity, sustainability, and partnerships as we look to meet the needs along the I-270 corridor. We're creating a transportation system that connects Marylanders to life's opportunities and works as a true multimodal system for all across a connected network of transit, roads, bridges, and trails. This administration has been listening and partnering over the last 8 months, and we heard we need a more balanced investment portfolio to meet the needs of Marylanders. As we advance the people, programs, and projects that are necessary to meet the transportation needs of all Marylanders, this commission and all of us have a critical role. Creating our transportation network of the future while preserving and maintaining existing services and our multi-billion-dollar infrastructure will take tremendous investment. Our transportation network must also compete economically on a regional, national, and global level. Frankly, we need to invest at a level that's greater than current resources provide. Currently, our team is finalizing the draft fiscal year 2024 fiscal year 29 Consolidated Transportation Program, or CTP as we call it. We'll release the draft in September and provide you with a full briefing on the CTP at our next meeting. But I can tell you, we are already seeing a budget shortfall of $100 million in fiscal year 25. And without being addressed, that shortfall grows quickly in subsequent years. And that funding gap is just to address the maintaining the current facilities and services and projects. Over the 6-year CTP program, NDOT's capital program shortfall is projected to be $2.1 billion. The shortfall does not yet include the additional investments we need to deliver better transportation system to the people of Maryland, the people of Maryland want and deserve. As you know, our key funding source is the Transportation Trust Fund. There are many pressures on the trust fund that impact the bottom line, such as historic inflation impacting labor and materials. Existing funding commitments, such as the Purple Line and WMATA, dredging the Port of Baltimore, as well as highway maintenance and bridge renovation and replacement. You're going to hear today about the nationwide impacts on the sustainability of motor fuel tax with fuel-efficient vehicles and electric vehicles, and reductions in the vehicle titling tax as people keep their vehicles longer, all impacting our revenue stream. As a result of these pressures, we're going to have difficulty delivering the needs and desires of today's users, as well as meeting our economic goals of the future, especially when you look at the later years of the draft CTP. It's true that we have a historic opportunity to compete for federal funding through provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure law, especially within the menu of discretionary grants available. But even this opportunity carries pressure for our budget because we must have the state funding available as a match for these federal formula and to compete for the discretionary grants. This commission offers us a reality check and an opportunity to look at our practices with a fresh perspective to deliver upon the Governor Moore's vision to leave no one behind. As we work together, we'll see the investments needed to transform the state's transportation system far outweigh our current resources. We'll also see opportunities to modernize MDOT and the state's transportation system. I know every person here is committed to creating a better transportation system, investing in a future that's more equitable, connected, and sustainable, one that will lift every Marylander and every community. Governor Moore and I have committed MDOT to be a good partner with the federal government, state legislature, and communities we serve. This commission is a prime example of that partnership. I'm confident that together we can explore options for equitable and sustainable long-term transportation revenue sources and develop solutions to deliver projects and essential services for future generations. So let me conclude by again thanking you for the commitment to serve on this commission and the time and effort that it will take to deal with some of these difficult issues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate that. That's quite a reality check. So we have a lot, as everyone, I mean, from the list that Paul just put out there, there's clearly, a lot for us to talk about and get on the table. And I'm looking forward to doing that in a way that allows for all of the members of this commission, to ask in, very direct ways, what that path forward looks like. So with that, I think we'd like to have the opportunity for the commission members to introduce themselves briefly before we move forward with the agenda as it's currently in front of us. Sure. Yeah. Commissioner Corman.
Mr. Chairman, you just want name, rank, serial number? What do you?
Start on that side.
Okay, you just want name and affiliation, or what are you looking for, Mr. Chairman?
Share is fine too, but I think
And I don't think anything I'd like to share. All right. Well, I'm trying to set the tone for everybody, Mr. Chairman. I am Delegate Mark Corman. I'm the chair of the House Environment and Transportation Committee.
I'm Senator Melanie Griffith. I represent Legislative District 25 in Prince George's County, and I'm the chair of the Senate Finance Committee.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Anderson, Secretary of Commerce.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Chang, member of Maryland House Delegates, Vice Chair of the House Appropriations Committee.
Secretary of Planning for this wonderful state of Maryland. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Delegate Jessica Feldmark, representing District 12A in Howard County, and I chair the Revenues Subcommittee of Ways and Means.
Good afternoon. Charlie Scott here, representing the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, better known as Metro.
Good afternoon, Catherine Banks. I'm President and General Counsel of the Maryland and Delaware Railroad Company and Executive Vice President of Chesapeake and Delaware. The Maryland and Delaware is a short line freight railroad on the Eastern Shore. We operate about 90 miles in the state of Maryland, and our customers include a number of the region's largest employers and biggest economic drivers on the Eastern Shore. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Todd Mon, the County Administrator for Queen Anne's County. I've been with Queen Anne's County now in my 32nd year after a brief stint in the private sector. So, and a professional engineer in the state of Maryland.
Hi, my name's Greg Ackerman. I'm the president of the Baltimore DC Metro Building Trades Unions. Our jurisdiction covers the entirety of the state of Maryland.
Good afternoon. My name is John Haynes. I'm on our policy team at the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And I'm happy to be here.
Good afternoon. I'm Patty Stevens. I'm the chair of the Worcester County Bike and Pedestrian Coalition and the co-founder of the Eastern Shore Regional Trail Network and a member of the Maryland Bike and Pedestrian Advisory Committee.
Thank you for having me here today. Mike Sakata, President and CEO of the Maryland Transportation Builders and Materials Association, representing the private transportation industry.
Tom Huseman, representing the Maryland Motor Truck Association.
David Winstead. I'm a local elected municipal official in Montgomery County and pleasure of representing MML here. I also had the pleasure of serving as Secretary of Transportation under Governor Glenn Denning. I was recently appointed by Governor Moore to be on the Maryland Aviation Commission. So I'm working with Paul on aviation issues.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Kirchville, Executive Director of the Greater Hagerstown Committee in Washington County. I was a former elected official and chair of our regional MPO.
Good afternoon. Nick Henninger, AU Director of Policy and Research at the Greater Baltimore Committee.
Mary Kane, I'm President and CEO of the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. We represent 6,800 businesses across Maryland, small, medium, and large size businesses.
Good afternoon, Regina. I was going to say my last name, my wrong name. Good afternoon, Regina Ali. I'm the Public and Government Affairs Manager for AAA here in Maryland and Washington, DC. AAA has 63 million members nationwide, and we represent about 1 million Maryland motorists. Thank you for having me.
John Laria, I'm a lawyer in Baltimore. I'm also on the board of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance and chair the Greater Baltimore Committee's Transportation and Mobility Committee. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oluseyi Olubenle, Deputy Director of the Prince George's County Department of Public Works and Transportation. So happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Josh Tolkien. I'm the director of the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, representing our 50,000 members and supporters in the state of Maryland, and I'm co-chair of the Climate Partners Coalition.
Hi, Antoine Thompson, Executive Director of Greater Washington Region Clean Cities Coalition. We deal with clean energy and transportation. Also, homeowner in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and a former New York State Senator as well. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Calvin Ball, Howard County Executive, President of MACO, and Chair of BMC. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chrissy Nizer. I'm the Administrator of the Motor Vehicle Administration, and I serve as the Governor's Highway Safety Representative.
Hi, I'm Senator Steve Hershey. I represent the Upper Eastern Shore. I also serve as a Senate Minority Leader, and I'm a member of the Senate Finance Committee.
Helene Grady, Secretary of Budget and Management, State of Maryland.
Hi, everyone. Guy Gazzoni, Chairman of the Senate Budget and Tax Committee.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Lambert from the Department of Legislative Services.
Jacqueline.
And Jacqueline Hartman, Assistant Secretary for Maryland Department of Transportation.
Well, thank you all. We're going to spend a lot of quality time together. So I just want to make sure we all know who's in the room. I think it's my former chief of staff hat that makes me want to organize people in some form or fashion. So thank you for that. The next on the agenda, I think we're going to start off with the organizational matters and the commission work plan, which is a continuing topic of conversation. So Michelle will kick that off, and I think Jacqueline will jump into. So take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Like I said, my name is Michelle Lambert, and along with my colleagues at DLS, Steve McCullough, Deneen Banks, Carrie Cook, Pat Tracy, and Ken Weaver, we will be staffing this commission, your work along with MDOT. I was asked to do a very quick overview of the charge of the commission. The commission was established under Section 2 of Chapter 455 of the 2023 legislative session. The commission is tasked to review, evaluate, and make recommendations concerning the current state funding sources and structure of the Maryland Transportation Trust Fund, the methods that other states are employing to fund state transportation operating and capital programs, including toll revenue, vehicle miles traveled fees, fees on zero emission vehicles, and non-transportation related revenue options, short-term and long-term construction and maintenance funding levels for transit, highway, pedestrian, bicycle, heavy rail, shipping, air travel, and other transportation needs, options for public-private partnerships, including partnerships with local governments to meet transportation funding needs, including funding options, changes in transportation technology and trends that will impact transportation infrastructure needs and costs to the state, existing practices for prioritizing project funding and options to better prioritize needs, the structure of regional transportation authorities and the ability of these authorities to meet transportation needs in various regions of the state, options for sustainable long-term revenue sources for transportation, and lastly, options for improving MDOT's ability and capacity to deliver major capital projects. As a commission, you have 2 years to complete your work. The commission is required to submit an interim report on the work completed, findings, and recommendations to the Governor and the General Assembly by January 1st, 2024, and the final report is due January 1st, 2025. DLS and MDOT will be providing staff to this commission together. So if you have any questions, me and Jacqueline are here to help you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline, who's going to go through a few logistics about your responsibility as commissioners.
Okay, thank you. Again, Jacqueline Hartman, Assistant Secretary for the Maryland Department of Transportation and former CFO of the department. So appreciate working closely with Michelle and with all of you over the next 18 months, as we have a lot of work to do, as you heard in the commission charge. We have reached out to you about some tentative meeting dates, all of those at least through the end of 2023 are scheduled at this point. So the other meeting notices will be coming out to you shortly. We do have 5 meetings scheduled between now and the end of the year, starting once a month, starting with us here in August, and then approximately every 3 to 4 weeks after that. Each of the meetings will be 3 hours in length, and all of them here. We may do some split out sessions into another committee room, but for the most part, we will be located here in this room for all of our meetings. All of our meetings will be live streamed and available to the public. And as you can see, as they public attendance at the meetings is open and encouraged as well. There will be opportunities for public comment along the way as well. So the first couple of meetings will just be a little more informational, but there will certainly be opportunities for public comment in the future as well. In terms of meeting materials, as you saw with this meeting, that will kind of be the standard where we're getting meeting materials out to you in advance. So you have time to review them before the meeting. Those materials are also publicly available prior to the meeting so that the public has time to view them in advance as well. And then, as I said, each meeting will be live streamed and open to the public. And then following each meeting, we'll have a meeting summary that goes out for those who are not able to attend the meeting or who do not want to watch the entire 3 hours of the meeting. And the meetings will also be available on demand. So several different options to make sure that the information brought to this commission and the commission's discussion are fully available and transparent to the public. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
So I don't think there's going to be a quiz on all of the charges, but as you can see, it is a very healthy and robust list of things that we need to talk our way through. Relative to the work plan itself, I would expect that there will be, opportunities for the commissioners to get better informed on particular areas that they may have interest in. And if they feel that there are deficiencies within the work plan, we certainly welcome your input to make sure that we are getting all of the items on the table for everyone to consider so that we have the best work product at the end of the day. So happy to open the floor to folks if they have any comments or thoughts in that regard. Or we can jump to Steve McCullough, who is just chomping at the bit to give us the overview. But I did want to say that, and there is a lot to be, discussed. And I just want to make sure that we're, making sure that you feel like we've got all of the cards on the table for the conversation. So I just put that out there. Okay. Steve, you want to jump on in?
Yes, we have the advancing the slides. Go ahead, and I don't seem to have control. So can we go to the next slide? It's not working.
We're going to take a second to make sure we're driving the
We're ready. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Steve McCulloch with the Department of Legislative Services. I'm in the budget function, and for this is my 10th year going in working in the area of transportation. I've been asked today to give a very, very high level, so it's going to be a very brief overview of transportation in Maryland, how it's funded, and how it's organized. So this outline will include a discussion of the Department of Transportation, the Maryland Transportation Authority, which many people get confused as being part of the Department of Transportation. It is a separate organization. And then the trust fund, which is the funding mechanism that will be much discussed during these sessions for the department's transportation program. So the Maryland Department of Transportation is organized into 5 modal administrations, although you'll see in another couple slides that the administration is now starting to talk about the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority as a 6th modal administration. It is the Metro, Washington Metro is owned by Maryland, but not completely. We've got 1/3 partnership with Virginia and the District of Columbia. But in these slides, 5 modal administrations, 5 or 6, depending on how WMATA is covered. It's a large department in fiscal 2023, which just ended. The department had just over 9,200 authorized full-time positions and contractual full-time equivalent positions, and spent about $5.5 billion, which we'll see in a moment. Now, historically, the transportation funding has not come from the state's general fund, has been relied mainly on the trust fund, but there are exceptions. And for the past 8 years, there's been some general funds that have been dedicated to the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, and there's also been some other state funds that have been used for transportation purposes. The 5 modal administrations, leaving aside the Washington Metropolitan Transit Administration, are the state highway administrations that constructs and maintains the state's highways and bridges, the Maryland Port Administration, which manages the state portion of the port, the Maryland Aviation Administration, which oversees the operations of the Baltimore Washington Thurgood Marshall Airport and the Martin State Airport. The Maryland Transit Administration, which operates transit service in the Baltimore region, soon to be in the Washington region with the completion of the Purple Line. And then the Motor Vehicle Administration, which license and titles vehicles and does the various services. Now, the Transportation Authority, often referred to as just the authority, is the entity that operates the toll facilities in Maryland. It is the only organization in Maryland authorized to set and collect tolls. So it operates from a separate funding source that is mainly derived from tolls, although they do have miscellaneous revenues as well. So they collect toll revenue from their 8 bridges, tunnels, and highways in the state, and use that for their operations, for their capital program as well. The toll revenue is not part of the Transportation Trust Fund, or TTF, so it's important to keep that. Although the authority is in statute allowed to provide funding and or financing for other transportation projects in the state, and there is some cooperation between the trust fund and the authority at times. So turning now to the trust fund, what is the trust fund that everybody keeps talking about? So Maryland has a unified funding source for the state's transportation network, and it's called the Transportation Trust Fund, or TTF for short. All of the revenues that are raised that you see at the top of this slide through the motor fuel tax, titling tax, operating revenues, corporate income tax, all of those revenues go into the Transportation Trust Fund. And then that unified trust fund is used to pay for debt service, for the operations of the Department of Transportation, and for the department's capital program. As well as part of that capital program, there are local aid that's provided to counties and municipalities. So Maryland is somewhat unique in having most of those modes, all of those modes under one umbrella. In many other states, as you will hear as we in future meetings, states might have a Department of Transportation that is limited just to the highway administration and maybe one other unit, where port administrations or transit administrations might be separate entities with separate funding sources. This final slide for my presentation shows the projected fiscal 2023 sources and uses, sources to the trust fund, and then how that was used. And as I indicated at the beginning, $5.5 billion in fiscal 2023. The three largest fund sources for the trust fund in 2023, and this is generally typical, are the motor fuel tax, the federal aid, and titling tax. Now, in some years, titling tax is number 2, federal aid was third. With the recent reauthorization of the federal funds increase, that's now taken second spot for revenues to the trust fund. On the spending side, you can see that the two main uses of the trust fund are to fund the operating program, which accounts for about 44% of spending in 2023, and the capital program, 38.7, not including the local government share, which is a part of the capital, but we show here on this slide as a separate piece. So those are kind of the parameters that this body will be discussing, looking at both the sources and the uses and the needs moving forward. And that concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman. I can take any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Steve? Commissioner Feldmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I guess process-wise, I'm not sure if this is the right time to also ask for additional information. I guess I'm, as chair of the revenue subcommittee, I'm kind of focused on revenues. So, when we look at all the different sources that feed into the Transportation Trust Fund, I would really like to get some historical data on those revenues, and an analysis of the trends, to look at what are the factors impacting that, from public policy decisions to technology to market forces, whatever is impacting those various revenue sources, to really get a good understanding of that as a baseline, and sort of looking at what factors we think are impacting those going forward. Thank you.
Great. We're good. Yep. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Next up, Joe. There you are. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Joe McAndrew, and I serve as MDOT's Assistant Secretary for Planning, Project Development, and Delivery. I'm going to spend a few minutes to walk you through MDOT's capital programming process today. Before I get started, I want to hark back to Steve's last slide. I'm going to cover the capital program, which represents roughly about 50% of MDOT's expenditures in 2023. MDOT is required by statute to annually develop the Consolidated Transportation Program, also referred to as the CTP, and provide certain data points within the document. The CTP includes project descriptions and summaries organized by mode. The CTP is updated annually with a rolling 6-year horizon. The horizon covers the current year, a budget year, and 4 planning years. The draft CTP must be released by September. And during the fall, the Secretary conducts a CTP tour, meeting with each county and Baltimore City to discuss the draft. Following feedback from the tour, meetings, and program updates, MDOT then publishes the final CTP in January and submits it to the General Assembly as part of the governor's budget submission. I want to provide a snapshot of how funding makes its way to the capital program, just so we understand. The first call on revenues that are collected into the state's Transportation Trust Fund is for debt service, followed by the operating budget, and then finally the capital program. Within the capital program, funding for WMATA, support for our local needs through the Highway User Revenue Program and the locally operated transit program are then prioritized. These funding levels are set by legislative mandate. State of good repair investments are next. These are the investments to maintain an acceptable performance of our multi-billion-dollar transportation system that we've already made. The Spending Affordability Committee sets a target level for state of good repair funding within the CTP. That leaves the remaining funds then distributed between the modes based on project needs and historic spending levels. Ooh, that was a nice graphic. So this is a cyclical process. This kind of graphic or table shows you kind of how we operate within the development and engagement and then legislative. MDOT does this annually. It starts with a process in May where we receive inputs from our modal agencies that Steve highlighted, but then also from our local partners through priority letters that I'll talk about again in a second. The draft CTP then is published by September 1, and the final is due in January. We start that hamster wheel again shortly thereafter. It's important to note that the CTP is part of a larger, what we call family of plans at MDOT. It represents just one piece of a three-legged stool. The other two pieces are the Maryland Transportation Plan. That's the state's long-range transportation plan, and the attainment report for system performance. This ultimately is the reporting process that tracks our progress against our goals and desired outcomes. At this very moment, both of these reports are being updated as we speak. They're updated once every 5 years, and the drafts will be released alongside the forthcoming CTP. The long-range plan and the attainment report are intended to inform the CTP development process. Next, I want to touch on our partners that are really important to the success of the CTP. To deliver on our multi-billion-dollar annual capital program, MDOT works with partners at the federal, regional, and local levels to deliver. Our federal partners at USDOT include the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, the Federal Railroad Administration, among others. We also closely partner with our metropolitan planning organizations that represent regions within the state and in some cases neighboring jurisdictions. And then also our local agencies are those counties and cities within the state. The federal partner is a major priority. At the end of the day, they provide roughly 40% of our capital program. We receive the majority of our federal funding through formula allocations direct from federal agencies. In addition, MDOT and also our local partners compete for discretionary grants, competitive discretionary grants to complete planning or capital construction. We've been successful, MDOT's been successful in recent years on projects such as North Avenue Rising, the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, knock on wood soon. We'll receive a grant this fall, the Purple Line, and hopefully in the future, the Red Line, just to name a few. It's important to note for the commission's work that these federal dollars are not free. They require a state match. The formula dollars that we receive require generally 10 to 20% match. And discretionary grants for those very competitive larger grants require sometimes as large as 50% state match. So we're going to need non-federal dollars to be able to access those federal dollars. So every couple of years, the federal government passes what we call a federal authorization that sets out the policy and the funding levels that we receive through federal formula and ultimately the regulations that we adhere to. The current authorization is called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as IJA. It was passed in 2021 and provides MDOT and our peer DOT agencies throughout the country 5 years of predictable federal aid. IJA roughly doubled the amount of funds available nationally for transportation compared to the prior authorization. It also includes both increased formula funds and competitive grants, and also created new programs that we are working to leverage and put into the field around things like EV charging infrastructure, carbon reduction strategies, and climate resiliency efforts. So a little bit more granular here. IJA allocated MDOT an estimated $1.5 billion in additional federal funding over the levels in the previous authorization. To access these funds, Maryland must allocate roughly more than $300 million in additional state funding to be able to access that full $1.5 billion. This last year in the CTP that we are currently working in, MDOT allocated or programmed $1 billion of that $1.5 billion in additional IJA funding, which required us to allocate an additional $176 million in state funds. A little bit more nuanced on how we both stretch and flex these federal dollars, just to make sure everybody understands what we can and can't do. We use in partnership with our modal agencies every tool that we're enabled to ultimately stretch the dollars as far as we can. A key tool that MDOT in the state of Maryland has available to us is called toll credits. These are MDTA generated toll credits that we are able to access for any work that MDTA does to improve the national highway system within the state using toll revenues. MDTA generated toll credits allow MDOT to use a lower amount of state funds to match federal funds. It's important to note that toll credits do not generate additional money. It just lowers the match requirement that we need to make to be able to access those dollars. The federal program also provides us great flexibility on where we ultimately decide the dollars should go. We receive the dollars and formula programs through an agency, whether it be the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, and we have great flexibility on where we can spend those dollars. The majority of the dollars that we receive come from the Federal Highway Administration to the State Highway Administration. And we can, within reason, flex those dollars to transit projects, and in other cases to the port or airport under certain opportunities. We can also use toll credits for transit projects if we deem it appropriate. Funds that are flexed, though, it's important to note, still require a state match to be able to access those dollars. Get off the federal level here and go to the MPOs. The Metropolitan Transportation Planning Organizations, also known as MPOs, are key partners to our work. MPOs are federally mandated and federally funded transportation planning organizations in our urbanized areas. Federal transportation funds in urbanized areas can only be used for projects included in the long-range transportation plans of an applicable MPO. This includes federal funding allocated to MDOT that we invest in within the geographic borders of an MPO. I'll pause here for a quick second and just say Maryland has 7 MPOs, 5 of which have boundaries extending into neighboring states. This is a little tough graphic to see, but you have it in front of you. We have MPOs stretching into Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. So not only do we need to partner within the state at the local level, but we also have to be in close partnership with our neighboring jurisdictions. Finally, another key partner to our efforts are our local jurisdictions. I think it's safe to say that MDOT cannot deliver upon our mission without close partnership with our local jurisdictions. Aside from ongoing and consistent collaboration and communication, MDOT provides direct state formula funding to local jurisdictions through the Highway User Revenue Program and the Locally Operated Transit Program. Additionally, local jurisdictions prioritize their infrastructure needs and make requests of the state through the annual priority letters. MDOT considers these priorities carefully for funding, as well as through discussion and engagement in the fall through the CTP tours. So in close, the CTP is a process. It is constant and always moving through. It is built on many factors, policies, and partnerships. As the secretary indicated, we will be releasing the upcoming draft CTP shortly. And next year's CTP is facing a financial headwind. That said, if we look back, just to kind of level set for everybody, the CTP that we are currently operating within provides $20.5 billion for our capital program over the 6-year period, with nearly 50% allocated to the State Highway Administration, 20% to MTA, and less than 1% to the Motor Vehicle Administration. In close, this is a high-level presentation. We're glad to take any questions that you have, but we're going to be diving into this in greater detail in the meetings ahead.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Do any of the members? Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary, great to see you in this new position. We're happy to have you. I do have a few questions. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think, can you go back to your MDOT capital program process? It was your 4th slide, but I know you're a part of a bigger deck here. So, the first row here, May 2023, CTP project requests county priority letters. So those county priority letters, is there some kind of format that a template you all send to the counties? So they rank their projects back to you, and then you go through and say, we're going to take projects 1 through 3 of Carroll County, Cecil County, Montgomery County?
No, well, we request and folks submit a letter to us. Ultimately, we engage in partnership with them to identify need and discuss with them how we can prioritize and work through and make shared investment within. I think oftentimes it depends on the county, their approach. Some are very short and nice and neat, and some are more elaborative. But each county takes their own unique approach to the process.
So MDOT doesn't do a project in Cecil County unless Cecil County asks for it?
MDOT, we will take on projects in Cecil County on assets that we own, that we prioritize. Hopefully we do them in partnership and prioritization with the county.
Okay, and if you don't fund a project, I don't know why I'm picking on Cecil County. If you don't fund a project that Dorchester County asked for, do you talk to Dorchester County about that? Do you tell them why it wasn't funded, how it could be funded next time, where it is in the priority queue?
I cannot speak to the prior administration. We intend to have constant dialogue about priorities with each of the counties, the letters that come in, their priorities, and have those open discussions about how we can ultimately make shared investments.
Okay, so the next step down the engagement step is the fall CTP tour to all the counties in Baltimore City. It has a name I don't like, the Roadshow. I prefer Train Stop Tour. Can you give me an example of MDOT ever taking a piece of feedback from one of those meetings and incorporating it into the final CTP?
I cannot. I'm new to this position, but ultimately I can come back to you with that information.
Great. Just a couple more, Mr. Chairman. Going down a little bit, it's not an engagement step, but I guess one of the process steps is legislative review of CTP. Can you give an example of the legislature ever changing something in the CTP during this 4-month review period?
I do not have that in front of me, but I can come back to you with that information.
Okay, great. And then I just have one more question about some of the secretary's comments. I guess I was a little surprised by what I heard. This will be the sort of 10th draft CTP I've seen as a legislator. I looked at a few before that in my previous life. I don't recall them ever showing sort of a shortfall in future years because MDOT can remove projects, and in some cases it can even raise revenue. Obviously, there's some revenues you can't control. So is that normal that the future years show a gap in the draft CTP?
This will be a new approach. It is our understanding that we are not required to have a fully balanced CTP upon draft, but we do by final.
Okay, so the plan is by January to have an imbalanced CTP.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner.
Yeah, question. How many years, there been any years that MDOT has not fully maximized their portion of the state fund match? Essentially, 10-20%, essentially not using all the obligated federal funds, or essentially leaving federal funds on the table.
I will come back to you with direct answer to that. It is a priority of this administration that we are not going to leave any federal dollars on the table.
Joe, just to follow up on the delegates, can you hear me? Can you get us on the local highway user revenue formula, this last topic? Can you get us the history of that in terms of what the funding levels have been based on the increases in the the Transportation Trust Fund, and also some idea of the split of projects, be it municipal, city, or county projects? That'd be helpful.
Yeah, we're going to do that. We will do that ahead of the next meeting, and we're intending to also have a presentation on that one in particular.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I am very encouraged by the enthusiasm for the questions, but I would like to recognize folks so we just make sure we're keeping these things in order. Commissioner Tolkien.
Thank you. I have a question and a comment. First, the question, you had mentioned that the system by which you assess the necessary funding levels for the state of good repair, but I didn't catch if that was a formula or a legislative mandate, how that is set.
So the state, wait a second. The legislature ultimately directs us at a level of what we should ultimately be targeting. We have discretion ultimately how that goes forward. We are working hand in hand to prioritize and better use better data ultimately to make sure that we are identifying need and getting out ahead of investments so that we are limiting our long-term exposure and cost fixes at a later date.
Wonderful. I think one thing I'd be interested in over the course of this is understanding the different ways that states approach defining and budgeting for the state of good repair. How different investments save or cost money over time. The other comment is just building off of Commissioner Corman's comment. I would be interested in some analysis over the effectiveness and participation of both the roadshow and the county letters, how often counties turn in their letters on time, participation overall, and if there's any other form of analysis or comparison to other states. I think that would be a good conversation down the road.
Definitely. We intend to.
Thank you.
Commissioner Chang.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Andrew, for the presentation here. I have a couple of questions to ask. First, regarding the federal funding, it shows on the slides here a couple of the different matching funds to access the money that's out there. Collectively, do we know how much out in federal funds and all the different pots that are out there that are available in the state of Maryland that we haven't accessed yet?
So we have a set of funds from federal formulas, and we are working to make sure that we don't leave any of those dollars on the table. Those are our guaranteed dollars. We have many opportunities for discretionary applications, and we've applied to some that have been announced this week. But those require match, and they're also competitive, and so we've got to be strategic so that we're not just chasing grants for grants' sake, but chasing them for strategic priorities.
I guess on the aggregate, do we know how much is out there roughly as far as federal funds?
I'll get the exact answer, but it was a sizable increase on the discretionary program side, as well as a sizable increase on new programs, reconnecting communities, EV charging and the like. So, we're trying to get our plans in place so we can compete for those programs as well.
Thank you very much. I think it'd be very important to go from the term sizable to actual dollars so that we understand what we're really looking at here. And the other question I have relates to what Commissioner Corman was asking about earlier. And you had mentioned that now there's a new approach to an imbalanced approach with regards to the out years. What led to that thought process of having a new approach?
We ultimately want to have, we're having a conversation here with this commission that's just starting today. I think we want to, as a new administration, also engage the counties and the General Assembly through the fall to identify priorities that meet what we can fund. And so, we're going to do this in partnership with the folks in this room, as well as our partners throughout the state.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Laria.
Joe, just a quick question on the federal match. I've heard for years, 20%, you just 10 to 20%, some programs are higher. What is the sort of genesis of that? I mean, somewhere in federal law regulation, but why 10, why 20, why more? And how susceptible is that number to change over time?
To answer the second question first, we've got predictability for the next 3 years, roughly, that those won't change unless an appropriations bill passes that changes it. So we're living within kind of a standard in that period. Generally speaking, especially on the highway side, they've prioritized things such as that support interstate commerce. So things like interstate enhancements or primary highways will require a lower state match. And then as you go down the arterial classification more towards a local or a county road facility, might require more. Transit on the capital side has always been a little bit more challenging. There aren't as many dollars and require typically there are many projects and limited dollars, so they try to stretch it as far as they can. So some applications come in, and if you're not deemed to meet certain criteria, you have to bring more dollars to the table to ultimately access the federal program.
And do you know, are those numbers statutory or regulatory at the federal level?
Largely statutory.
And are they susceptible to change statutorily as we all are thinking about the environment in which we're living?
Not, they haven't changed in many years.
who decided that 20% was a good number? Like, why pick that number?
That's a great question. I would, congressional members of Congress, generally speaking, yeah.
Thanks.
Commissioner Stevens, you have the next question.
Yes, hello, thank you for this information. I had two questions. One is about plans. Your slide about the family of plans mentions, I think, 5 plans. The bike and pedestrian community has given feedback this year alone on, I think, the pedestrian state plan, the bike plan, a state trail network plan, and also the state rail plan update as it relates to potential intersection with trails. How do those comment processes, that input, roll up into these higher level plans?
Good question. So the kind of mother of all plans is the state's long range transportation plan. It helps sets the policy and drives the kind of vision of where we want to be 20 years from now. It is informed by all the plans that you had discussed, as well as other plans, such as recently the State Highway Administration released the Pedestrian Safety Action Plan. It is not project-based, it's more policy-based and goal setting. So that's the main plan. Also, to track progress against the long-range transportation plan and keeping our assets in a state of good repair. The attainment report is a report that we update every year. We reset the goals, or sorry, the criteria or metrics that we're using every 5 years. And those 2 reports get submitted alongside the CTP in January every year. There are other plans that happen throughout, whether it be a capital program type of planning exercise, a long range plan exercise at the modes as well. But ultimately, we are a multimodal family at MDOT, and the Secretary's office has a planning team that coordinates with all of the modes.
Okay, and I have a second question. I've been looking at the Reconnecting Communities Neighborhoods grant that the federal grant that you outlined. There are a number of, I believe, for disadvantaged communities, there is not a match requirement. There are a number of projects, for example, on Lower Shore County priority plans that specifically are addressing reconnecting communities split by Highway 50 or 113. Those look like great opportunities to pursue federal funds that don't require a match. Is that something that MDOT is looking at?
We are on our own assets. We're looking at opportunities and in discussion with local jurisdictions that those facilities traverse, but we are also working hand in hand with local jurisdictions on facilities that they own as well, because we want to both put in our own applications because we have needs, but also support our local jurisdictions. And so if you have any projects that you would like for us to be aware of, we are both supporting through letters of support, but also engaging the federal delegation and the Biden administration.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Commissioner Thompson, you were next.
Yes, just a few quick questions and one comment. First, and you probably don't have this readily available, but at the next meeting, if you can provide some insight on the COVID-19 funding that was mentioned, what type of projects are we trying to fund? And if there's any, projects that haven't been committed, sometimes projects are, they fall off the table, right? And so we want to make sure that we're maximizing that. One thing that I am concerned about is our office had a listening session earlier this year in Bowie. There was someone from USDOT that was saying that they are concerned that a lot of the local governments in the region and state governments are not doing enough to apply. We're getting some, but not given all the money that's coming. And I know it's a delicate balance, but the lady works in the secretary's office. She lives in Bowie, and she was just saying that anything that we can do to push folks to apply, because we get a lot of the alerts every day, and we got to just be more aggressive, and whether we have to get some consultants or get more staff to be able to do that. But she did raise that at a forum. And the other thing I wanted to ask about was the concern about equity as it relates to the maintenance. I live in Prince George's County. the state roads, the crosswalks are horrible. They often are faded. We have a lot of vehicular accidents that kill people. So anything that could be done on those state roads to make sure that we're addressing that. I often say you can see the change when you go into communities based on the crosswalks. And I think the state can do a better job. I know that Delegate Nick Charles had a number of hearings last year in forums around the maintenance of the lots and the parkways. I know when I leave my house, whether I'm going up Pennsylvania or I'm going down Suitland Parkway, they're doing a better job this year, but it's still a lot of work to be done in some of those crosswalks and some of that maintenance. I know they address some of those disparities, but anything we can do to try to look at long-term sustainable strategies would be great.
Yeah, I'll touch on that item. Secretary Wiedefeld, he indicated in his remarks, but he charged MDOT to ultimately don't leave any rock unturned, like look under everything from funding to policy to regulations to try to meaningfully bend the curve on roadway fatalities and injuries that we have on our facilities. And we're working with Administrator Nizer in the lead there. But, this is a huge opportunity, a huge need. And we have, going back to federal money or state money, we have great opportunity. We also have a lot of need across the state, whether it be just striping and crosswalks to right-sizing some of our roadway facilities and designing them to try to slow down vehicles and limit casualties as best one can.
That if there are times where your office needs letters of support, we get them from some of the other local municipalities and some of the other states, but we haven't really been asked by the state of Maryland too often to do letters of support to DOT and some of the other federal agencies for some of this funding as well. So we're here to help and support.
We look forward to taking you up on that.
Thank you. We're going to take the last two questions for Joe. I think we're Commissioner Winstead and then Charlie.
Just to follow up a bit on the issue of the federal funding, the discretionary programs, which are enormous. I mean, the funding's doubled or more. One real issue for the smaller municipalities in Maryland is the time of response is ridiculously short. And it really handicaps a lot of the smaller communities that are interested in some of these transportation planning or Safe Streets for All grants. So both for you and Paul, I think maybe the congressional delegation needs to get involved in this, but they're coming out with great opportunities, but unless you're a large charter county with a huge DOT department, very difficult to respond by the deadlines. I mean, I think it was 6 weeks. The latest round announcement came out and then 6 weeks you had to have a project. So you probably heard this before, but it is a concern.
We feel the pain as well. What I will say, and whether it be formula or policy or regulations, we do have predictability so long as Congress appropriates the dollars to these programs for the next 3 years. And so, we'd love to sit down and we've got a team that could help kind of strategize because the cycles are starting to hit a cadence, right? Safe Streets for All should come up next summer again. So what can we do between now and next summer to think strategically to prepare?
Or just a delegation letter.
Yeah, that too.
To the US DOT secretary saying, our experience in Maryland has been, that smaller communities cannot compete because they're not given the time, something like that.
Joe, this is probably a data request that you plan to supply us with at a future meeting, but I know at Metro, inflation recently over the past few years has really impacted our capital program, concrete, steel, labor, all the inputs. So I'm sure we're not unique. I'm sure other modes have been impacted by the same. So similar to Commissioner Feldmark's request on the revenue side, could we get some analysis on the expenditure side of what has been the impact of inflation over the past 5 years or so?
Yeah, inflation, labor costs, et cetera, they're going up. But yes, we do intend to have that discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You were very popular and he will be around. So, you know, you'll have ample opportunity to, you know, ask more questions. So thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Next up. Ward.
Chair Principe, Secretary Wiedefeld, and members of the commission, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the American Public Transportation Association, or APTA. APTA represents all sectors and modes of the $80 billion public transit industry, from public transit agencies and state DOTs to manufacturers, suppliers, and engineering firms. Transit agencies directly employ more than 430,000 workers and sustain millions of private sector jobs. As both a Maryland resident and APTA representative, I welcome the work of the Commission on the transportation revenue and infrastructure challenges in our state. Today, I'm going to focus on the fiscal cliff that is looming for many public transit agencies across the nation. At the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials asked people to stay at home. Transit agencies told riders to only use their systems if absolutely necessary. As a result, public transit saw a dramatic decline in ridership. Yet even in those dire times, public transit continued to serve essential workers, healthcare workers, pharmacists, grocery store clerks, and helped our communities survive. In the wake of the pandemic, public transit ridership continues to make steady, somewhat slow progress. Today, ridership is approximately 72% of pre-pandemic levels. We are hopeful that, similar to what we've seen in the last 2 years, that after Labor Day, we will see another stepped up increase as schools return to session and more workers return to the office. As a result, although public transit funding has increased, passenger fare revenue dropped significantly with the decreased ridership. This loss of revenue has a critical impact on public transit agency budgets. The budget impact is greatest on public transit agencies such as WMATA, San Francisco's BART, New York MTA, that have historically relied more on the fare box revenue as a source of funding. To the extent that the fare box is not a significant part of an agency's budget, such as in Richmond or Austin, the loss of that revenue has less impact. The loss of fare box revenue also has a much more pronounced impact on public transit agencies' operating budgets. On average, fare box and other agency revenues, such as concessions or advertising, provide 35% of operating budgets. Conversely, these revenues provide only 11% of capital budgets. It is also important looking at these pie charts is to note the federal focus of investment. The federal government provides 1/3 of capital funding, but less than 10% of operations funding. And it varies differently by the size of community. So under current federal law, transit agencies in large urbanized areas, such as DC, Baltimore, those with populations greater than 200,000 may not use their federal funds for operating assistance. It is only available for capital projects. Conversely, transit agencies in smaller communities such as Hagerstown, Frederick, and others may use their transit formula funds for operating or capital, although the federal share for operating assistance is at a lower 50% match rate. In reviewing transit operating budgets in more detail, we see that almost 2/3 of all operating expenses are for salaries, wages, and fringe benefits. Thus, the fare box revenue shortfall has the potential to directly impact the transit workforce. In addition, it's important to note that different transit modes have different cost structures. The operating characteristics of the transit agency, whether they're a bus system, bus and commuter rail, a combination of all different modes, those combined with area labor costs and other factors directly impact the cost of overall operations. There was a question from the commissioner earlier on pandemic aid. From the transit side, during the pandemic, Congress recognized that essential role of public transit in our communities and the existential threat to the services and workers without additional assistance. Over 3 separate congressional acts, Congress provided almost $70 billion of emergency funding. Unlike the traditional capital focus of federal investment, Congress provided these funds specifically for operating expenses as a first use to help agencies offset these fare box revenue losses. Today, more than 99% of these funds are obligated to specific projects, and the overwhelming majority of them are fully expended. I don't know Maryland's specific situation. I've not seen them come up on any lists I've seen showing significant or any really existing balances in those accounts. So with this context, as transit agencies develop their budgets looking forward, they recognize that the COVID-19 funds from the federal government are fully expended. Operating costs have increased, along with inflation and other factors, and ridership and thus fare revenues have not fully returned. As a result, many agencies face a significant operating budget shortfall or fiscal cliff. In May, APTA conducted a survey of its transit agencies to better understand the breadth of the shortfall. Based on responses from 122 agencies representing the overwhelming majority of transit riders in the US, we found that 1/2 of all agencies face a fiscal cliff. Let me go back here. In the next 5 years, including 71% of large transit agencies, many of which face significant operating budget shortfalls. We also found that some agencies face the fiscal cliff sooner than others based on the specific kind of budgetary framework that they have. For most agencies that will experience a cliff, it will hit by fiscal year 2026, if not before. The operating budget shortfalls that the largest agencies expect to encounter range from 10 to 30% of their overall budgets, and it invariably grows over time. So we also asked the agencies about their potential responses to the cliff. They're focused first on identifying additional resources, state and local funding, and new revenues. They're also looking at ways to reduce transit agency costs. They are less likely to view cutting service, the workforce, or increasing fares as viable solutions. They believe that those will affect ridership recovery, and they don't want to take any steps that will affect the ability to continue to transport people. And states we've seen have begun to act to address this shortfall. So in May in New York, the legislature reached a budget agreement that provides billions of dollars for the New York MTA and other state transit agencies through a combination of revenue, funding, cost reductions, and fare increases, including they increased their their payroll mobility tax for the largest businesses in New York City, providing $1.1 billion per year. They're dedicating casino licensing fees for 3 new casinos, $1.5 billion. They're providing state and local funding for specific purposes, which provides approximately $1 billion. They're implementing MTA, New York MTA operating efficiencies. They've identified $400 million that the agency must find, and they're instituting some limited fare increases. New York estimates that agreement will address the MTA budget through fiscal year 2027. This summer, California similarly reached a budget deal that includes additional funding for public transit in its state. The California budget provides $5.1 billion for public transit. The agreement includes $1.1 billion of new funding for a zero emission transit capital formula program. Although it's a capital program, they provide the flexibility that particular regions can use 100% of that funding for operating expenses if necessary. They funded this through, California has a greenhouse gas reduction fund, which does acquire significant revenue, and they are using funds from that particular greenhouse gas fund to finance this investment. The budget agreement also restored $4 billion in capital funding for transit. And again, they allowed the flexibility for regions to use those funds for capital or operating. That addresses the immediate issues in many California communities of the operating budget shortfall, but there will be more work to do in future years. So on the federal level, in terms of federal actions, earlier this year, as part of the president's budget, he proposed to address the fiscal cliff by providing transit agencies flexibility in the use of their federal transit funds in fiscal year 2024. First, the administration proposed to allow large urbanized areas to use their urbanized area formula grants for operating assistance. As I mentioned earlier, right now under current law, it can only be used for capital grants. At this point, neither the House nor the Senate have included this proposal in their transportation appropriations bills. Second, the administration proposes to increase the federal share to 100% for mobility for seniors and rural formula grants. This proposal is included in the Senate bill. Based on our discussions on Capitol Hill, we believe it is unlikely that Congress is going to step in and provide the necessary additional resources to address the transit fiscal cliff. Congress fully expects state and local governments to address this fiscal challenge. As the commission develops its recommendations for transportation investment, I urge you to remember the critical role that transit plays in the lives of our most essential workers. In the summer of 2020, thinking back to that ridership slide, just months into the pandemic, transit ridership was 40% of its 2019 levels. That illustrates what a lifeline it provides to Maryland and across the nation. And the benefits of transit investment are extraordinary. It connects people to jobs, education, healthcare, and businesses. It creates millions of public and private sector jobs. For every $1 invested in public transit, we see $5 in long-term economic returns. It fosters energy and independence and equity. It saves billions of gallons of gasoline and helps to address climate change. It advances equity by providing access to opportunities. With that, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the commission. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. I heard on the prior panel, there were a lot of questions about the federal role. I worked in Congress for 25 years. I'd be glad to kind of give my perspective if you had further questions on those issues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ward. Really appreciate that. Commissioner. I'm gonna work on it. You're gonna teach me.
Yeah, you'll be perfect by the time we're done with this. It's Olu Benley.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Couple of questions. So the survey that you mentioned in May, is it possible to extract the information specific to Maryland so that we can see and better understand the state of transit in Maryland?
I think it'd be best to probably ask the MTA for their most recent information on that, because it does constantly change in terms of, we've seen different activities from that. So that is somewhat dated now in terms of where we've been. There may be new collective bargaining agreements that give them a better picture. So I think asking MTA directly for that, and we can help facilitate that if you'd like, but I think I know Ms. Arnold is a member of the commission. I think they're probably best positioned to answer that question.
A great friend. The other question I had was, do you have details of the budget deals that were done specific to other states that you have mentioned, like California, similar to Maryland? I don't think we have a Greenhouse Reduction Act fund, right? So similar to some of the deals that were done. It would be interesting to see how that is structured?
I can provide kind of a several page overview of both the New York and the California agreements, and also help facilitate meetings with the people who worked on those there's a whole variety of elements of some of those. So
Right.
in California, it's both the funding, but then there were also some accountability measures that were part of the agreement where transit agencies have to discuss how they would help to improve that rider experience. So there's a variety of elements, but we would be glad to, work through the commission to provide you additional information or additional meetings to discuss those issues.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Commissioner Laurie.
I'm going to take you up on your offer
Okay.
to give federal perspective. I know we don't have time for a detail, but you heard my question earlier about the percent, that the match percentage. You've sort of touched on the same issue in your slide on the administration, where you say that, one idea is to allow large public transit agencies to use urbanized formula grants for operating assistance. Another one in which 100%, meaning no match, essentially for certain specific groups, in this case, mobility, disabilities, et cetera, what's the hope for any of those sorts of rescue missions to succeed ultimately, including, for example, changing the match, which was my original question, just trying to get a sense of the tenor of things.
I think, and on the federal side, and this is not from my APTA perspective, but more my just congressional experiences, is one of the things is from a Congress standpoint, they have historically wanted the state or locality to have skin in the game. They don't like the idea of 100% federal. They also, as I kind of mentioned, they want to focus very much on capital investment. They don't like, as a general rule, the idea of providing operating. What you see across federal programs is a whole, 80% is the typical match for formula grants, for most discretionary grants. The big difference you see really is in the Transit Capital Investment Grant Program, which is the highly competitive, very large project, what are often called new starts. So the purple line, the red line fit within that category. For probably close to 2 decades now, it's been typically a 50% match. Now that changes with administrations to some extent. We haven't seen it really change yet with the Biden administration. During the Trump administration, that percentage went down significantly. It was really in the 30s, high 30s. They wouldn't fund a project that was more than 40% under that category. But to your point earlier, this administration is a little bit less focused on leveraging the federal funds. So they're not as focused on, we need a higher state match. They are looking at things, I think in many, if not all the programs, also through the equity impacts. And so there are some very limited opportunities, but reconnecting communities is one where you can now get 100% match. I think to the broader point, which was mentioned earlier, is this is a unique opportunity. We've never seen these kind of increases in a generation from the federal level for transportation. Maryland wants to be on the forefront of taking advantage of those. It is, on the transit side, we saw a 60% increase in funding. On the passenger rail side, it's a 500% increase in federal funding. Having your funds lined up to meet whatever that match requirement is to compete in the discretionary opportunities is critically important. It is also not in just transit and passenger rail. There are funds across DOT. Reconnecting communities is an example. That is not, it doesn't fit within this framework, but transit and passenger rail are eligible across numerous DOT programs. And this administration is much more willing to consider them as part of that competitive grant process.
Commissioner Ali. Yeah, no, sorry. Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to follow up on Commissioner Olubeni's. How'd I do? Kind of, okay. I kind of want to follow up on the commissioner's question. And it's not really for you, Ward, but you're sitting there and we're talking about this topic. I really think it's for MDOT, so I'll just put it out there. I think we need very specific information about both systems because Maryland funds 2 essentially 2 urban transit systems, in one case, 1/3 of a urban transit system. And we need the current information about the fiscal cliff, but also what's contributing to that fiscal cliff, which in the case of WMATA, I know is both inflation and fare box issues. I think with MTA, it's a little less fare box because, to your point, they weren't as reliant on the fare box. I think we also need related information from MDOT. For example, with MTA, there's a backlog issue of capital needs that's been a big focus. So I think that's a component that we need a lot more information on. So I think we need really specific information about Maryland's role in both of those systems and what the needs are. Ward, that's not your job. Appreciate you being here though and teeing up the topic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The ridership question, I'd like to delve into a little bit more. In terms of we know COVID was a market disruptor, but there were also trends already happening. So to what extent can we get, first of all, data of where the trending was happening before 2020? Because I know from my vantage point, what I was seeing is we were already seeing a trend. We amplified it during COVID. And so both understanding that ridership issue from the standpoint of other correlations, where are people moving, where are they migrating to, even changes that were already starting to happen in terms of hybrid workers. People basically, once they know they only have to drive in once or twice a week, then they do it versus the transit every day. Obviously, this is so important because really those left are the ones that have no other options, and we have to make this a continued viable option. But the other things I was starting to see, because I've studied this some, is electric vehicles, electric bikes, scooters. We're changing how we get around generally. So I want to make sure we don't glom on to this ridership, curve that happened during that period of time, but really understand the bigger issue of ridership and just how people are getting around, because I think it'll inform where we might see projections around that aspect of revenue, and how we can improve that piece, which might be more in our control than how much funding, which we obviously have to chase also. But is that something your group can do in terms of these bigger trends and other correlations that might be inform this whole issue of ridership?
Absolutely. We can provide a decade or more, if you'd like it, of the historical ridership. And I think and also by mode.
Right.
Because I think what you will see is that around 2014, ridership plateaued. Some it had been going up consistently. It plateaued, went down slightly. To be honest, immediately before the pandemic, it started to go back up. And now that got lost in that 3 months later. We saw these enormous cuts because people were not riding transit for understandable reasons. I think what we've seen kind of post-pandemic is bus ridership is back overall at a much higher level. That is a more transit dependent community as a general rule. Those commuters, say for instance, commuter rail, that they have struggled more in terms of some of their ridership because they have more ability to work from home. We also see very different regional impacts in that communities, like I would say, the DC area and Maryland generally, more highly educated areas where there are more office workers, the San Francisco Bay Area, you see much less in terms of the daily commute than you do in other communities that might be more working class, where they don't have the option to work from home.
Exactly. We really need to get more granular, I think, and really understanding the demographics, the geographies, the job types, who is in that. I'm also wondering in terms of ridership, if we maybe need to right size how we think about transit, just as commercial airlines have had to sort of look at more regional models and sort of more micro models. Because what I've found, particularly with bus type systems, often they were old systems that were built at a different time and haven't adjusted to cross connectivity in terms of, are we really meeting the market where it is today? And so But I think you get my point. I'm sort of really want to understand that ridership question a lot more. So thank you.
Commissioner Henninger, I'm trying to pick between the two of you who is, I'm sorry.
Commissioner, I'm not a commissioner anymore. Jim Kirchville. And playing to what was just said, I think getting some more information in ridership, from every article I read, the impact of COVID, that's a long-term permanent effect on how people work, which is impacting air travel and office space, everything. So it seemed like a lot of the article or in the letter you read and things, it talked a lot about recovering the revenue. But what is your industry doing to kind of adjust to that change in how people work? It doesn't seem to me ridership's going to pop back right away just because now COVID's gone and we're working there. That seems to be long-term challenges. So what are we doing in affecting what ridership is probably going to be dropped and stay down or at least plateau, or what's your projections?
I mean, I would say it's somewhat community dependent. We have many agencies are more than 100% of what they were pre-COVID. So it depends in part on the community and what role transit plays in that community. I think what we're seeing, our transit agencies are being very active in terms of considering changes. So to the point earlier, they are redesigning their bus networks, realizing that things have changed and maybe that they never really looked at that in 20 years. And now they are making, active changes to those issues. So I think you're seeing a lot of work as to how to improve the rider experience so that people will continue to use it. And we are seeing, some of this is the commute to work and what that means. I mean, I know as someone who works in Washington, D.C., the downtown there has not fully recovered compared to certain other communities, partly because the federal government has not really returned to work in full force, at least in the office. And so, you see differences there in terms of how agencies are addressing it, but they are very actively looking at ways to improve that experience. Commuter rail ridership is up on weekends. People are taking it for discretionary trips into New York or other places, but that commute level still might be at 65 to 70% because they're not going into the office every day.
Thank you.
Commissioner Thompson.
Just one quick question for the gentleman. A lot of great information. Some states are looking at bond acts and other creative things to increase capacity for its infrastructure and some of its transit fleet. What's your take on that?
I think we see a lot of different state-specific responses. So many states have sales taxes, which provide a significant contribution to transit, where they do a 1% very specific sales tax. That allows them more flexibility in terms of how to fund their system. We see other states, are more aggressive in the bonding market. I mean, we support, a lot of these seem to have very state-specific histories as to how willing a state is to consider different revenue options and financing options. But we think that from our standpoint, every option should be on the table and kind of fit what works well for your particular state and the dynamic of what, say, a legislature is willing to support.
Thank you.
Commissioner Haynes, you have the last question for Ward.
Oh, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ward, for that really informative presentation. Eye-opening. My question is, I'm curious if you have a sense from your membership, or if you provide this in another survey, just a forecast of personnel needs, in the same way we think about capital spending over the next 5 years. As I'm sure you and your membership are aware, recruitment and retention is a very serious challenge for so many transit agencies. And I'm curious if you can share any insight in terms of how they're approaching that challenge and how we're thinking about that in the long term.
I would say beyond funding and kind of resolving some of these operating issues, the transit workforce shortage is probably the second biggest issue among our members. We have a significant shortage, and that's led to increased costs. You will see a lot of agencies now have to provide bonuses to new employees to get them to come on and become a bus driver or take on different roles. We've done 2 specific studies on that, which I can provide to the commission on within the last year that look at the shortage. I think there are a couple different factors going on there. One is, I think the reality is coming out of COVID, it is, it seems like the social network among people has changed some, and that people are often more hostile. Clearly, bus drivers see that regularly in their own experience. We see certain members will decide that they could be, they have a commercial driver's license. They can go drive for Amazon or a different company, and will take that as a choice, so that they don't have to deal with some of those issues. That is one factor. Increasing pay, which we are seeing a lot of agencies address, that is another factor. And the other issue, which really leads into some of the collective bargaining discussions, is that a new employee, particularly say an operator, might have to work weekends for 6 years before they have enough seniority to improve their schedule. A lot of young people today, that's not a choice they want to make. And so that has been one of the biggest deterrents, is trying to come up with a local solution with the union that can allow us to refurbish kind of the needs of the workforce.
Thank you so much. This is a very, very good presentation and lots of great questions from the commission. So I appreciate it.
Thank you,
sir. Mr. Regan, how are you?
Good. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to have a very optimistic forecast. Wait a minute, this is not the presentation, is it? There we go. Okay. My name is Ed Regan, and I spent 45 years of my life working for Wilbur Smith and CDM Smith, a transportation consulting firm. I ran the tolls practice, was involved in several projects here in Maryland, like the funding of the intercounty connector and managed lanes on I-95 and so on. So I'm familiar with it. But now I'm retired. So what I'm going to talk about today is from me as a consultant and somebody in transportation finance for his whole career. It's not necessarily the opinion of CDM Smith, but I'm sure they would agree with me anyway if we were here. Talk about the motor fuel tax. By the way, this presentation was developed at a national level. I've made several presentations using this type of thing to state legislatures through the National Conference of State Legislators in Chicago and New Orleans and LA and Salt Lake City. This one was a recent update that was done. It presented in Salt Lake City a couple months ago, together with an IBTTA, a toll industry meeting on road user charging. So its focus is national, but I added a few slides, adapted it for some evidence with respect to Maryland. Motor fuel tax in America. I could at best say it's a system at risk. It served us well for 100 years. It's an efficient proxy for a direct user fee. The more you drive, the more you pay. But its days are numbered, both due to increasing fuel efficiency and, most importantly, a dramatic shift toward fully electric vehicles. Today's presentation will take an updated look based on the sustainability of the gas tax, rather based on building upon the latest 2023 Energy Information Administration, U.S. government, EIA annual energy outlook. And also I've created 3 alternative future fuel scenarios regarding what's going to happen with the gas tax. Let's start by looking at recent U.S. fuel sales trends. The chart in the upper right is basically total fuel. The blue part of those bars represent gasoline, and diesel is the orange part of the bars. We've seen continuous growth from 2012 through 2019. 2012, there was a total of 172 billion gallons of fuel consumed in the United States. That rose to 191 billion in 2019, and then boom, with COVID, travel went down, it dropped to 170. Most importantly, though, in 21 and 22, it's still at 185, meaning it's still less than it was pre-pandemic. In 2022, vehicle miles of travel nationally, total travel was within 0.5% of what it was in 2019 before the pandemic. So essentially, travel had fully recovered nationally. Now in Maryland and other urbanized areas, it might be a little bit lower because of work from home type of tendency, but it's within a percent or two even there. Yet fuel, even though the travel was back to it, total fuel was still almost 3% lower in 2022 than 2019, and gasoline sales themselves were down by 4.4%. So it seems like we've reached peak fuel. Now, I've been making these kind of presentations for a long time, and I always had a forecast where we continue to grow up to a certain point and it'll start to decline. The decline has started. We are headed down, and the right three columns, the lighter colors, using the EIA reference case forecast, do not forecast fuel sales to recover at all from 2019 levels. In other words, even by 2025, we'll be below that level. In Maryland, a little bit more variability by year. Here, we saw a big drop in 2020 due to COVID pandemic. I mean, you had basically averaged about 3.3 billion gallons a year. Through 2019, it dropped to 2.7, and now it's back up to about 3.1 billion gallons in 2022. Total fuel, by the way, in 21 was up by 10.9%, even though it was down by 18% the year before. Gasoline up by 14%. By 2022, fuel sales are still 5% below, in Maryland, are still 5% below what they were in 2019. Gasoline is about 4.4% down. Now, in your state, VMT is still down a little bit, about 3% versus 2019. Again, because of Baltimore and particularly DC, you've got a lot more work from home type things, but you still are almost back and fuel is on the way down. So Maryland has also reached a peak. Here's a chart shows some from other nearby states. Virginia, you could see it grown up to 4.2 billion gallons by 2019, dropped to 2020, and it's now down to 4.0. In other words, it recovered back. It's still down 400 million gallons. Delaware, 5.6 in 2019, 5.0 in 2022. I'm sorry, that's actually 100 million, 550 million, and now it's down to 500 million. Pennsylvania is still down 4.6 billion in 22 versus 5.0, et cetera, and New York. You can kind of get a trend here. The emerging, I want to talk initially about one of the biggest factors, the emerging surge in new electric light vehicle sales. Between 2017 and 2020, new electric vehicle sales, and that includes all plug-in electric vehicles, whether it be full battery electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles, averaged around 300,000 through 2019, or through 2020 rather. But EV sales in 21 increased to over 635,000, which is 4.25% of total light vehicle sales. In 22, the next year, up to 915,000, a threefold increase over what it was just 2 years earlier. And based on the first 6 months of data that I've checked, we should reach 1.3 million new electric vehicles in 2023. That would be about 9% of all light vehicle sales, cars, SUVs, and so forth, in 2023 nationally. Light duty vehicles in Maryland, in this chart, again, similar pattern. In this case, battery electric is blue and plug-in hybrid is orange. Basically, in 2016, you had, these are registrations in the state, you had 8,200 vehicles or electric vehicles registered. 2022, you had 69,000 vehicles. That is a 9-fold increase in a period of about 6 years. You right now have 1.36% of Maryland registered light vehicles are electric, as compared to 0.17% in 2016. In 2022, electric vehicles were more than 7% of light vehicle sales in Maryland. The US average was about 6%. And Maryland electric vehicles per thousand population, which is an interesting statistics, went from 2.03 in 2017 to 9.16. That's just for whatever it's worth. That's the 12th highest in the United States. Okay, so looking forward, we obviously have a very consistent set of forecasts for electric vehicles, as you can see here on the left side of this chart. The near-term estimates over the next 8 to 10 years through 2030 or 32 in some cases. The EIA 2023 energy outlook is the most conservative that you see there. The blue line at the bottom of the chart, that's an official government forecast, but it's higher than their prior ones in prior years, but it's still the lowest of all the people making forecasts. It's estimated to reach about 16% by 2032. As I said, by 2023, we're going to be up to 9%. So, I mean, I think that's going to be low. Bloomberg New Energy Finance typically is one of the highest. That's the red line you see here. And their recently updated numbers that they've done, they project that electric vehicles will reach 50% of total light vehicle sales in the United States by 2030. Two other companies that are shown here are actually 4 other companies' projections, a few even higher than Bloomberg New Energy and some in the middle. Those are the different outlooks that we have, but all of them are going in one direction. So when I did this analysis, I decided to create 3 hypothetical scenarios. One is the blue line, which is the low end here. That's the EIA reference case, 2023 EIA reference case, what they call a reference case EV share. The red line is based on the Bloomberg New Energy Finance. That's the high optimistic forecast. And then I created a mid-level, which is simply just on a percentage basis, halfway between the blue and the red line. That's probably closer to more likely. Certainly, I think the blue is very, very pessimistic. That dot that you see on the top where it says new EPA, you may recall that EPA has come out with some recent recommendations regarding climate change and greenhouse gas reductions that say we can meet our targets if we can get to 67% electric vehicle sales by 2032. That's all we need to accomplish. We ain't going to accomplish that. That's above even the most optimistic line. But it does show that even the federal government is starting to anticipate a big move toward electric vehicles. Now, let's talk in terms of fleet. This chart shows the fleet share, which is really what will drive fuel consumption in the future. Not sales, but it takes 12, 15, 20 years to overturn the entire fleet of vehicles driving on the road. In this particular case, our low estimate from EIA basically says that we should reach about 5.5% of the total fleet by 2030, 12.3 by 2040, and about 16% by 2050. The high end forecast says by 2040, we'll reach 48% of all cars on the road, cars and other light vehicles, and 60% by 2050, 60% of all light vehicles. And my in between mid-level has us at 30% in 2040 and 38% in 2050. This chart shows a comparison of estimated total US fuel sales. Now, the black part on the left is actual data. That's what we actually experienced, actual historical. And as I mentioned before, in 2019, we peaked at 191 billion gallons of total fuel, including diesel sold. In 2020, because of COVID hit, reduced travel, that dropped to 168 billion. And by 2022 or so, it recovered to 185. So nominally, that's where we stand. The orange line on this chart, that upper line is completely hypothetical. It basically says what fuel consumption would be if there was no change in fuel efficiency, no increase in electric vehicles, and really no change at all in MPG. Totally hypothetical, just for comparison purposes. The growth rate is based on the EIA forecast of increasing travel throughout the United States. So under that hypothetical scenario, we'd grow from 185 billion gallons in 2022 to 231 billion gallons by 2050. Again, this is just for comparative purposes. The blue line basically shows what I call calibrated, because they had to calibrate against the actual count, but the EIA reference case forecast itself, which says that we're going to drop. And we're going to drop to 169 billion by 2030 and a low of about 155 billion gallons by 2040, and a slight increase. Under the worst case scenario, with a high level of electric vehicle penetration, we're going to drop to, by 2040, to 114 billion gallons and 107 billion gallons by 2050. This chart shows a comparison of estimated, this is one other thing that the NCSL folks had asked me to do. What happens if there was no increase in electric vehicles, just increasing fuel efficiency? That's the black line. And the black line, we still would see a decrease. Even if there's no increase in EV sales, we're still going to see a decline down to about 171 billion gallons by 2040. Basically, this simple chart shows at 2035 and 50 levels how much things are going to go down versus our hypothetical case. Our hypothetical case assumed no change in fuel efficiencies, just normal growth of travel. Under the fuel efficiency, increasing MPG, but no increase in electric vehicles, we would still drop by 2050 by 22%. By the low, very conservative EV forecast in the EIA, that drop would be about 30%. In my mid-level forecast, 41 or 42%, and more than 50% under the high electric vehicle forecast. This chart just shows forecasted federal fuel tax revenue. Why should you care about federal fuel tax revenue? Well, you heard several of the past speakers tell you how important federal funding is to your overall picture. 40% or whatever, typically in most states, come from that. Even on the transit side, a lot of people don't realize this, but something like 15% of the federal gas tax, which is what I'm showing here, federal gas tax, which hasn't been increased, by the way, in 30 years. 50% of that goes to transit funding. So it's a big issue, federal. Here we see that catch up to myself here, that federal gas tax revenue is about $37 billion last year. That would grow up to about 46 billion with the orange line if there was no change in fuel efficiency. But even with the low electric vehicle forecast, that'll drop to 31 billion by about 2040. And under the worst case scenario, I say worst case from a revenue standpoint, probably best case from a standpoint of climate change and greenhouse gases, the red line would drop you down to about 22 billion from 37 today and versus 46 of what it would be based on the growth of traffic. This just compares those things, gives you a little simple comparison. You can see as early as 2030, we're looking at a 17% reduction in federal gas tax. And again, Congress has not changed the gas tax rate from 18.4 cents a gallon for gas and 24.4 cents a gallon for diesel since 1993. So the logic of them continuing to raise gas rates consistent with increasing fuel efficiency is zero. 2040, we looked at, and this is on our mid-case scenario. It's not the worst case scenario, 35% reduction and 42% by 2050. What if the EV pop is closer to that Bloomberg forecast where we get up to say 50% of the cars on the road are electric vehicles By 2050, we'd be looking at a 51 to 52% reduction in federal gas tax. And to overcome that, you'd have to double the tax rate, and you can take wagers or whatever on how likely that is that Congress will double the federal gas tax rate. Obviously, a lot of the HTF is subsidized by general fund now, but that's still a gloomy outlook. Okay, so what about annual? Okay, this is not a Maryland forecast. This is like all the 50 states combined with the total travel in the United States. By the way, a weighted average gasoline tax in the United States, weighted average based on the vehicle miles of travel in each state, is just under 35 cents a gallon is the average for gasoline, and 38.4 cents a gallon for I don't know what Maryland's is, but that's the average statewide. State in total generate about $67 billion a year from the gas tax, excluding some states have special sales taxes on top of that and things like that, not including that, just the per gallon. Basically, it was projected, if there was no change in fuel efficiency, from 67 billion to 88 billion by 2050, just from increasing travel. And under a mid-case scenario, we could look at that dropping to 48 billion from 88, and even lower under the high case scenario to about less than 40 billion by 2050. What's it mean? Well, you can figure it out. By 2050, in this case, state gas tax revenue, typical state gas revenue, be dropping by $35 billion or 42% by 2050. And if we have that high level of electric vehicle penetration, that'll drop by 53%, more than half. Okay, and I don't know how many states are out there want to double their gas tax rates to preserve that level of thing, but pretty important stuff. So in conclusion, a couple of key points. Number one, America has likely reached peak fuel consumption in 2019. I would not be at all surprised, except in a few states where have very high levels of population growth, if you will ever again see more fuel sold than was sold in the year 2019. Electric vehicles sales are beginning to surge. Expect 1.3 million new light vehicle electric vehicles sold in 2023. It could reach 50% of all new vehicle sales by 2030 to 35. Some states, California, I know I live in Connecticut, they're talking about trying to pass legislation to do the same thing, are talking about banning the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035 or 40. Due to increasing fuel efficiency and electric vehicle penetration, future fuel consumption, and of course, gas tax revenue will decline significantly, 25 to 35% by 2035. 35 to 50% by 2050. In short, the days of the motor fuel tax as the primary source of funding for transportation in America are numbered. We will likely see widespread change, or a need for widespread change in how we fund transportation, increased tolling, other types of things. Most likely, probably going to see at some point, 2030 or so, a broad-based implementation of direct road user charging, a program in which you'd shift the burden from a tax on gallons consumed to a tax on miles driven. That's another story I could talk about sometime in the future if you'd like to, but I'd be pleased to take any questions. No questions.
Thank you, Ed. Commissioner Corman has a question followed by Commissioner Winstead.
I'm that gunner in law school, for those of you who went to law school. So one specific question for you and then a broader question for MDOT again. The specific question for you is, you have the 21-22 Maryland annual gas sales on one slide and then the other sort of surrounding states in another. And Maryland's the only one that saw an increase in gas sales between 21 and 22. And I'm wondering if you had any idea why that was.
It might have been a slower recovery from COVID. In other words, a lot of that, the pace of the recovery was given or influenced by the percentage of people who are working from home and how quickly they return to the jobs where they were working. And Maryland, given its proximity to DC and also Baltimore area, might have that. I don't have an answer for that exactly, but that could be one of the factors that contributed to it. But we're still, as I said, we're still by 22, you're still well below where you were in 2019. Your travel, VMT is also down by about 3%, I think, too. So that kind of underscores it. But I think your longer term is going to be driven by that big surge in electric vehicle purchases.
Great. And then just like with APTA, I'm going to pivot from you to sort of, I think, information we need from MDOT to make this useful, which is how this translates into Maryland revenue, both the fuel efficiency and the EV sales and what impact that has. And then it's not in this presentation, but I think the same thing is true of the inflation impacts and how that specifically has impacted Maryland and not just the national trends. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Winstead.
Ed. Thank you. That's the question. So, you know, the charts certainly demonstrate that the current funding mechanisms of the state are not going to work. Given technology that we all have in our iPhones and cars and the computers, what's the transition you see to VMT billing? I mean, what's happening now to kind of experiment? I mean, you know, Waze is tracking us everywhere we go. We know they know. I was just curious, what's the technology now to make that?
I'm really glad you asked that question. Unfortunately, for about close coming up to a decade here, with a lot of federal funding, we've done a lot of pilots. States have done pilots. Maryland's part of the, I know they call it something different, but the 95 Coalition has done a lot of that work and so forth. And most of those pilots really have been focused on overcoming opposition as opposed to solving the problem. I think, as some of these charts showed you, that really we need to be looking ahead to 2030 to 35, where we really have this fully working and fully operative. Now, it's going to take a while to transition, surely. But also what you see in these pilots is not what will be implemented in the future. I anticipate, and maybe I'm have a unique position on this, but I anticipate the need that the ultimate shift to road user charging will be dependent on in-vehicle technology that already exists. After we solve the privacy concerns, that's the biggest challenge we still have to do. Absolutely, I'm not sidestepping that as the biggest challenge. Eliminate the privacy concerns, but we need to have a scenario in 2030 to 35 where every vehicle in the country, or at least every vehicle in the region, is equipped and can track where you are and what for a lot of reasons, where you are and when you are there. And I'll give you 5 reasons. One is, and your state is a perfect example. A lot of people in Maryland will drive in Virginia or DC or Delaware or whatever. So ideas like, well, you just give us an annual odometer reading aren't exactly the most appropriate way to allocate revenue. Whereas at least with the gas tax, where you buy the gas, influences where the revenue goes to the state. So interstate travel is, I think, a big issue that needs to be resolved, and giving an annual odometer reading isn't going to do it. Secondly, I think we're seeing a shift, particularly on the West Coast, but I think it'll eventually get here, and maybe your committee will actually contribute to this kind of shift. We're going to see a shift of funding mechanisms from federal and state to also an increased role on a local basis. Maybe there's going to be a local share of funding for certain projects that are going to come from mileage fees that may be implemented in a region, in city of Baltimore or in a certain county or whatever the case may be. Third, we look at the idea of transit. Okay, that last speaker spoke at great length about transit subsidies and operating cost subsidies. I mentioned that the federal gas tax, something like 15% of that goes to transit. So you pay that whether you're in Cumberland, Maryland, or whether you're driving in DC or whatever. If wherever you're driving your car, you're paying a federal gas tax that's being used for transit, even if you don't have transit available. If we're going to do road user charging right, then we should be able to actually make that more equitable, where a supplemental fee, let's say, to support transit would be applied only where transit's available and not to people that don't have it. The fourth reason is we're moving toward maybe, sort of, possibly a time where you're going to have some form of congestion pricing or variable rate structures. And if we have technology in the vehicles and all the vehicles are equipped and it can let you know or sense where you are and when you are there, you can introduce a program where you could vary the rates by time of day to help reduce congestion. That's obviously an issue that's not going to apply everywhere, but it might apply in approaches to DC or whatever. And then finally, and you know, this is a small point, but it's probably a relevant point in Maryland. We got an issue of tolling, and we may see increased use of tolling. You've got a lot of tolled bridges and tunnels. You've got Kennedy Highway, Kennedy Expressway. You've got the express lanes. You got all kinds of tolling. One of the biggest challenges for the toll industry for 50 years has been the question of double taxation. When I basically drive on a toll road, I'm burning gas, so I'm paying gas tax and paying a toll fee. If we have a technology that's smart enough so it could be used where that technology can also be used to collect toll revenues, then people won't be charged, you know, a federal fee or a state fee to drive on a toll facility. These are all interesting things, but none of them are possible if the answer to the question is, let's do an annual odometer reading and charge us once a year. Why am I making this speech? And I'll tell you why. Because it's a very, very critical moment. There's $50 million from the IIJA in federal funding for what they refer to as a national pilot. 50 million. Okay, if they use $50 million to do nothing more than do a pilot for 50,000 vehicles instead of, they should also use part of that money to challenge industry, to solve the privacy issue, to solve the technology challenges, to figure out how to integrate with telematics that are already built in these vehicles and so forth, so that we can help shape the way we do road user charging in the future from an equity standpoint and an effectiveness standpoint, because folks, we ain't going to rely on a gas tax very much longer. Sorry for the long answer to the question.
Yeah. Commissioner Kirchhoff or Henry? Oh, see, they switched on me. You're just keeping me on my toes.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation and for the great data behind it. I did have one interest in the slopes of the curves as we get out towards 2040 and 2050. Why is it that you predict that the growth in EV sales or usage will kind of taper off over time?
Well, there's actually just a simple reason for that. And that is that the high optimistic forecast get up to like 80-something% of new vehicle sales, and then they level off. I'm not sure why, but I mean, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's already at 80 or 90%. And then the low, stays down there. When I split the difference with the half, it kind of winds up gravitating toward that. You know what I mean? It's not so much that it really will stop. It's just a question of the splitting the difference between one here and here winds up with that result. I think it will likely continue. I think it's very likely that in Maryland, you're going to see, let's say 40%, 50% of vehicles on the road that'll be electric, and then it'll continue to grow after that. But I always have asked myself that same question.
Thank you.
Function of the curves, I guess, probably math.
Hi. Presentation, thank you. That was really marvelous. I don't think we should lose sight of the good news here in this, and that we're actually making progress in terms of reduced use of gas and all of the things we want to do. It relates to climate change. So, but how does that get balanced? And so I would like to hope that in addition to electrical vehicles and, miles per gallon, that maybe land use and smart growth is also having some impact in terms of compact development. So if you add that layer onto the analysis also, we may be up more towards that red line, actually, if we continue to trend there. The thing I guess I want to put out there for all of us is keeping in mind rural areas. So the road user charge concerns me, and I think we have to have a big pivot here, like a totally different pivot in terms of how we think about mobility and how people get around so that we don't have severe inequities. Because, for instance, the housing plus transportation index in rural areas is as much as 50% of total income. And those folks are very important to our economy also. And so we wouldn't want to end up with a regressive tax of some sort where those in rural areas have an even larger share of their overall income being attributed. So I just want to throw that out there. And I don't know if that's been in any of your analysis of how do we create really a whole new paradigm on how we think about mobility and entirely new alternatives.
It is a big issue that's always raised in anytime you get the discussion of road user charges. The reality is that from the standpoint of, one argument always made that people in rural areas or whatever drive more. Okay, but they also consume more gas when they drive more. So that's not necessarily going to be made worse by mileage charges. They also actually, from other work that I've seen other people do, not me, but the actual types of vehicles that people in rural areas drive tend to be less fuel efficient, pickup trucks and things like that. And so actually, road user charging could help that. But the biggest thing I would say, and it kind of relates to my little epistle that I went on before in response to his question, is that if we do it right, the people in rural areas can really benefit in terms of equity from this. If we have the ability, for example, to take transit subsidy piece components of road user charging and only assess it in areas where the transit is, then the people in those rural areas aren't going to be paying it. For example, if we don't do it right, if it just becomes an annual odometer reading, then basically the equity issues that can be solved through this are not going to, people are going to pay the same whether they have transit available to them or not. And I think that's an example of how it can be. But it is an issue that gets raised all the time. I think it's an issue that has to be overcome. But I do it in the long term, and I'm not talking about increasing their taxes or anything else, but as compared to the gas tax, it may not be as bad as some people in rural areas think, because they already are driving more and are already consuming more gas as they do that.
So the last two questions will come from Commissioner Tolkien, followed by Commissioner Laria. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. This is actually just a comment, probably more for the group of MDOT. I think that the progress on hybrid and electric vehicles is a result of national and Maryland public policy, and understanding how this is actually part of Maryland's goal is important. Like that curve is aligned with both the development of the state climate plan as well as the governor's commitment to the new Clean Car 2 standards, and I think reflects the state's goal. And at the same time, I think whatever revenue source must help us meet our transportation needs, but can also be critical in advancing other health and equity and economic benefits. And I think sort of understanding all of this in the context of our climate goals and our public transportation goals and our health goals will help us sort of parse revenue sources. So we're not just looking at them in terms of how they're feeding the transportation trust fund, but also if they are encouraging or discouraging the types of behavior or development trends that we want to, and sort of getting the state towards a multitude of interconnected goals. So I guess the question for the future is, I think, bringing those codified state goals and metrics and indicators into the conversation when it's associated with something like the gas tax, I think will help us sort of ground the conversation in all of those factors.
I've raised a couple times the federal government and their role in all this, and I don't know whether we're working together to solve this or across purposes or what. It's interesting that there are no federal representatives here, nor necessarily should there be, because we're trying to solve this problem for Maryland. But so many of these problems are rolling downhill from federal policy. And I guess I'm wondering at some point how we all figure out with people in other states and other advocates to address this. I mean, and what's the reason I say that in part about this is, the driven home for me now is, so the federal government is making enormous investments in EVs, right? By providing credits. I don't know what that number is. It's got to be gigantic.
It is.
Right? And I wonder if in that debate, someone said, well, this is really great, these EVs, but what about the fact that we're basically going to cause everybody to get less fuel tax? And it's the usual thing where you have competing public policies pitted against each other. So no complaints about the EVs. It's just, and the credit, it's just a question of dealing with the collateral, consequences of it. So I don't really know where that goes, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm just saying that, are we trying to solve this problem in a static federal box? Or are we trying to solve this problem more dynamically, where we have to find a way to get the federal government to change its policy, and that we're not going to do that ourselves? But at the end of the day, a lot of the rubber meeting the road, no pun intended, is federal policy. It's not state policy.
A fair observation, John. I think that, the last, revenue package that we engaged in was the state package that was absent, the federal participation. Again, I don't ever speak ill of our congressional teams. They're doing, amazing work in DC, but that's a really important point. I think we need to think on that. So Commissioner Thompson, I think you have the last call.
Yeah, I was going to take it off, but then I put it back on. But no, just really quick. Just two things on that. I just want the team to think about this. I know this is our first meeting, but what you said, Mr. Chairman, about 10 years ago, may be a 5-year problem, because right now we're talking about EVs and the gas tax, but there's other things that this gentleman, I don't know if he's even looked at autonomous vehicles and what the economic consequences is going to be on that. And by the time this plan is over, we'll be debating about flying cars, right? How is that going to impact your road tax? So I don't think this commission's plan is going to last 10 years, because there's a lot of smart people working on that. And that's going to have even more dire consequence on the infrastructure, 10 to 20 years out. So I just wanted to share. I don't know if you looked at
If I could just throw in one thing, because I have done research on that, and I actually did a little animated video on it. The thing that's going to be interesting about if autonomous vehicles really take off, and there's still a big if on that, and also level 4 versus level 5, and there's a lot of different things that can affect that. But if we get widespread use of autonomous vehicles, they're going to dramatically reduce auto ownership. Okay, those vehicles, though, will still be consuming something, whether it's gasoline or electric, and most likely, very likely, it's mostly electric. Future autonomous vehicles will be electric and not gas consuming. But the interesting thing is that I've done analysis that suggests that, if we shift away from individual car ownership to that, you're going to have somewhere between a 15 and a 25% increase in total travel, because these vehicles will be moving between picking up people and dropping off people. And if people don't own their own cars, there'll be a lot more travel with empty vehicles and that type of thing. You're going to have a big reduction in demand or need for parking facilities, which could have some secondary economic impact in cities. But you're going to really, most importantly, you're going to have an increase in total miles of travel, but a big decrease in fuel consumption, because most of those vehicles will be electric, in addition to being autonomous. For what that's worth, I don't know, but that complicates things even more. I don't want to get into that.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very
Appreciate it.
much. Thank you.
Dr. Horowitz. Yes.
Copies of the extra presentation if anyone wants them.
Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to the chairman, and commission for the opportunity to meet with you today. First, I have to say, I'm sorry you can't see my face, although you're not missing much. It's certainly not my preference, but I'm on the back end of CDC protocol, so I hope you can still hear me all right. My name is Josh Hurwitz. I'm a senior economist at the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, or ARPA. We are a national trade association that advocates for sound infrastructure investment and policy at the federal level. We also have excellent state affiliates, including the Maryland Transportation Builders and Materials Association, which is represented on this commission as well. Today, I'm going to provide a brief national transportation construction market update with an emphasis on highlighting early impacts of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, since that's one of the biggest potential market drivers our industry has seen in a long time. I'm also going to focus mostly on highways and bridges, given our time allotment, and since we've already heard some excellent information on transit. So given the multi-year nature of the construction pipeline, we like to analyze the market in phases. So starting with forward-looking indicators, things like trends in funding, and ending with actual construction activity. So today I'm going to start by discussing the federal funding picture under IIJA and the obligation of those federal funds. Then I'll discuss State Department of Transportation budgets to see how overall Transportation Funding Authority has evolved with that boost in federal investment. Next, we'll look at recent trends in highway and bridge contract awards, which capture the value of newly contracted work that is now underway or soon to break ground. So another important forward-looking indicator. Lastly, I'll conclude by looking at the actual value of construction activity as it's put in place. And as part of the closing analysis, I'll also provide an update on the inflation environment, since that's certainly been the biggest macroeconomic headwind that the industry has faced over the last several years. So before diving into the data, it's often useful to illustrate that market pipeline and the various market indicators we'll be discussing by walking through an example project. This is a project awarded by Arkansas DOT in 2022 to replace 14 bridges. So first, while not itemized on the slide, the DOT, of course, would have had to identify the necessary budget authority to fund this project. So for state DOTs, that budget authority comes from state, federal, and other funding sources. And we'll talk about national trends in state DOT budgets shortly. But in January of that year, the project was awarded to a low bid contractor for about $50 million. So this would show up in our contract award data that we'll be discussing, again, as an indicator of market activity to come. 2 months later, in March, the work order is released for construction to begin. And then 2 months after that, the DOT decides to obligate $20 million of federal funds to the project. And it also has the ability to obligate additional federal funds at a later date. Note that in some cases, that obligation of federal funding can precede the contract award as well. But this obligation would then appear in the federal data that we track as a new federal aid project commitment. We'll be looking at trends in those new federal aid project obligations shortly. Note that at this point, no federal money has actually been transferred to the DOT. That obligation creates a liability for federal reimbursement at a later date. So construction on the project will begin. The DOT will make payments to contractors directly, and then will submit for federal reimbursement up to the amount obligated. So as is typical with these types of projects, construction for this one is expected to take place over several years. And as work gets completed on that project, that will show up in the value put in place data. So that's a project level example of the various metrics that we'll be talking about at the national level. And this multi-year timeline is very important for analyzing, any type of market question, such as, is the IIJA working, is something that we hear a lot about and we'll explore. So first, let me provide a brief overview of the federal funding picture under IIJA for highways and bridges. And just as a precursor, on average, federal funding accounts for more than 50% of state DOT highway and bridge capital outlays. So it's a key pillar for highway and bridge construction. This chart shows the historic ramp up in federal highway funding under IIJA beginning in fiscal year 22. The blue bars include both total formula and discretionary funding. The red bars show any supplemental dollars that are added during the annual appropriations process. Note that about 86% of this funding are formula funds, so those flow directly to states. States have considerable discretion over how those funds are allocated. The remaining 14% are discretionary funds. Those are controlled by US DOT and mostly distributed via grant programs. So over 5 years, that's about $300 billion in formula funds and then about $48 billion in discretionary funding. So if you look at that year one jump in federal fiscal year 2022, that's a 38% increase over the previous year. We went back to the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, and we found that this was the third largest ever annual increase in federal highway funding, surpassed only by 2 years in the late 50s, immediately following that Highway Act. So it is very much a historic increase in federal funding. In the out years of IIJA, those funding levels are sustained and actually increased by about 2% annually, plus any supplemental appropriations that are added in the appropriations process. Now, importantly, when you observe this graph, you see that the biggest leap in funding in terms of growth rate happens in that first year, so federal fiscal year 22. But it's important to note that the expected incremental spending associated with IIJA is expected to increase each year through fiscal year 2026. And in fact, more than 40% of total IIJA funding is actually expected to be spent after 2026. So keep that in mind as we talk through the pipeline. So what are we seeing so far with the obligation of these funds? This chart shows the number of projects in the US that newly commit federal aid highway dollars. So it's excluding existing federal aid projects that received additional funding from IIJA. In federal fiscal year 22, again, the first under IIJA, there were more than 29,300 new federal aid highway projects obligated in the US. That was 8% higher than the previous year. And something to keep in mind is that the federal appropriations process was delayed in 22. So states really did not have access to IIJA funding until, roughly halfway into the fiscal year. So the line on the chart shows new project commitments to date. That's through June. And you can see that there was indeed a slow start in fiscal year 22, likely due to that delay. In the current fiscal year, there have already been more than 19,300 new federal aid highway commitments, which is about 30% higher than this time last year. So overall, we're off to a very strong start in 23 in terms of new federal aid projects. I just want to quickly note as well that if you're interested in seeing the type of projects that have been obligated in Maryland, if you Google ARPA highway dashboard, you can see a full accounting both of formula projects as well as discretionary grants that have been made for Maryland as well. So the next indicator to discuss is state DOT budgets, which of course not only incorporate that increase in federal funding, but also reflect more comprehensively how total transportation funding is growing with IIJA. So how are states leveraging that increase in federal funds? So the blue bars here are aggregating total budget authority for all 50 state DOTs, so operating and capital budget authority. And then the line shows our estimate, going through budgets line item by line item of budget authority specifically for highway and bridge capital spending. This chart is organized on a state fiscal year basis. Most states, except for a handful, have a July 1 fiscal year start. So in this case, fiscal year 23 is really the first year where you're seeing IIJA flow through into state budgets. Note that between fiscal year 17 and 22, before the Infrastructure Act, average annual top line budget growth was about 5%. In fiscal year 23 and 24, the first 2 years under IIJA, that top line growth rate was 12 and 11% respectively. So more than double the typical growth rate in both years. And similarly, if you look at budget authority for highway and bridge capital spending, that's increased by 13%, both in fiscal year 23 and 24 relative to a preceding 5-year average of 6%. What's especially interesting is analyzing the sources of budget growth over the last 2 cycles. So in fiscal year 23, nearly 70% of that net budget increase was attributable to increased federal funding. Think about that first year cliff jump from the chart we just looked at. What's interesting though is that in fiscal year 24, More than 70% of that net budget growth has been driven by increased state funding initiatives. So just as a few examples, Florida and Tennessee made general fund transfers to DOT of the amounts of $3.3 to $4 billion. Those are to accelerate highway projects. And then Minnesota added and increased dedicated sources of highway funding. That's expected to add an additional $1 billion plus in recurring revenue for DOT. And there's other examples as well. And it's important because ultimately the extent of IIJA's impact will depend on how states are able to leverage this funding opportunity. And so far, we're seeing very little substitution and in some cases, significant complementary investments. So overall, the national trends in DOT budget authority are also very strong relative to previous years. And again, we can see that flow through impact of IIJA through budgets as well. So with that increased budget authority, states are able to put out more work. This chart is showing the total value of both state and local government contract awards for highways on the left and then bridges on the right. We're now on a calendar year basis. The bars are providing full year totals and then the line shows year to date totals through June. Again, so you can benchmark progress through the first half of this year. The first thing to notice is that in 2022, the first effective year of IIJA, there was a 26% increase in the value both of highway contract awards and bridge awards. That's a record increase over the several decades we've been tracking this data. For perspective, the average annual growth rate in the preceding 5 years was 6% for highways versus 26 and 0 for bridges, which tends to be more volatile. Then on top of that record growth for 22, we've continued to see really strong movement through the first half of 23. Year to date, highway contract awards are up another 19% and bridge awards another 10%. So continuing to see some really strong front end indicators more than a year and a half into IIJA implementation. This slide shows that growth in contract awards has been mostly widespread. So this is grouping states based on their calendar year 22 increased in combined highway and bridge contract award value relative to 2021. Those awards were up in 38 states and they were up by more than 30% in 25 states. Even many of the states that were down or flat in 22 are seeing significant growth so far in 23. Maryland was down in 22 for highway and bridge, but up overall. There was actually significant investments on the rail and transit side that year. And year to date in 23, seeing some modest growth for highway and bridge awards as well. Note that these increases are in nominal dollars. So they do not account for the extreme inflation that we saw during much of 2021 and 2022. But when you look at the number of newly contracted highway and bridge projects across the US, those also increased by 16% for highway and 6% for bridge in 2022, whereas average annual growth was 2% and negative 1% respectively in the preceding 5 years. So in 2022, there were more than 4,800 more highway and bridge projects awarded relative to 2021. And again, that strong growth has carried into the first 6 months of this year, especially on the highway side. We're seeing another 9% year to date increase so far through June. And bridge awards are about 3% above this time last year. So overall, the contract award data is another very positive forward-looking indicator of market activity, and that volume of newly contracted projects is one piece of evidence that points towards some real market growth, despite the headwinds that we've seen from inflation, which I'll now discuss in a little more detail. So this slide presents 2 national cost indices that are specific to highway and street construction, as well as a benchmark CPI index, which is, widely tracked and known as a measure of aggregate inflation in the economy for a general basket of goods. Both of these construction indices provide a weighted measure for typical inputs into highway construction. So they include energy costs and material inputs, things like concrete and asphalt, but they exclude labor, overhead, and imports. The blue line comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Producer Price Index. It's based on prices paid directly to producers of construction inputs. And then the red line comes from Federal Highway's National Highway Construction Cost Index. That's based on the prices reflected in state DOT low bid contracts. All three series are normalized to start at a level of 100 in the first quarter of 2015. And by some miracle for this presentation, all three series happen to converge exactly at a level of 109.9 as of the third quarter of 2020, which is right before inflation really took off. So we'll use that as an inflection point here. If you look between 2015 and most of 2020, all three indices were growing at an annual average rate below 2%. Then in 2021 and 22, the PPI index grew at an average annual rate of about 16%, and the NHCCI by about 24%, and that's annual over 2 years. The CPI also grew at around 7% annually, which is a level not seen in decades, but still not as extreme as the highway-specific indices. Note that this doesn't mean total project costs were rising at this level necessarily. Again, these indices exclude labor, which was probably rising closer to CPI as well as overhead. But nonetheless, inflation has been very extreme in the industry, and certainly, undoubtedly has had an impact on the scope of potential market activity. One more important observation from the chart, through 2021 and part of 22, prices paid to input producers were rising faster than bid prices, suggesting that contractors were having to absorb part of these increases. Then this flipped in 2022. That's after inflation proved to be more persistent and unpredictable than most were forecasting, including the Fed, which certainly increased the risk to contractors as they bid on contracts. So if there's a silver lining, at least for now, it's that when you look at this PPI index, which is available through June of this year, there has been a significant easing over the last 4 quarters. That index is actually down slightly over the last year, and it appears from the most recent data point that the NHCCI data, that the NHCCI index will also follow a similar trend. This slide is looking just a little bit deeper under the hood of those indices, particularly the PPI index, looking at comparing for individual inputs, the average annual cost increase from 2012 to 2020 versus those experienced in 21 and 22. The point of the slide is so you can really see just how extreme some of these cost movements were. For example, the average cost of diesel and other energy inputs had actually fallen in the preceding 9-year window, but rose at an annual rate in the ballpark of 50 to 77% in 21 and 22. Asphalt, iron, and steel also experienced 40 to 50% average cost increases following a fairly flat decade. And then inflation for many concrete products, while not as extreme, was also very significant relative to historical trend. And then lastly, I wanted to show cost dynamics for specific inputs over the last 12 months of data. Again, this is where we started to see that flattening of the aggregate cost index. You can see that most of the relief has been coming from energy prices. So diesel fuel, certainly, also things like asphalt, iron, and steel have come down over the last 12 months. But we're still seeing persistent above trend cost increases for certain key commodities, particularly many concrete products. So I would say we're in a much better position than we were, a year and a half ago, but I wouldn't say that we're fully out of the woods when it comes to project inflation. But given that extreme inflation environment that's occurred, it can be hard to, exactly assess the real level of market growth that we've actually seen. There's many different ways that you can apply and weight cost indices, and economists will bicker with each other endlessly about these types of calculations. So we wanted to try to identify some real measures of growth that are less sensitive to these debates. One measure that I already discussed was simply looking at the abnormally high growth in the number of newly awarded projects. And then a second approach that we've taken is actually going through state DOT contracts and calculating the actual material quantities of key materials that are being demanded in those contracts. You can see a few examples on these slides. Asphalt demand was up, around 7% in 22, concrete pipe up 10%. So we definitely believe that there has been real front-end market growth, although undoubtedly lower, again, than what we'd be seeing in a normal inflation environment. The last key indicator that for us to look at is the actual value of construction activity as it takes place. So in calendar year 22, highway value rose by 14% and total market activity across all modes rose by 6%. Bridge work was actually down a little bit in 22. But again, because of that multi-year nature of construction projects and the prolonged spend out of funds, we expect lag time between a major funding increase and when we see a corresponding increase in actual activity. We do anticipate significant market growth in 23 and beyond, as some of the very positive front end indicators we looked at translate into more projects getting completed. Through May of this year, as indicated by the yellow line, we are starting to see that acceleration of growth, particularly for highways. So from a broad perspective, we would argue that IIJA is working and really only just beginning to show its ultimate market impact. It's not a coincidence that over the same period, we've seen significantly above average or record growth in federal aid project commitments, state DOT budgets, and contract awards. And it's really these front end indicators, again, where we would expect the most significant growth at this stage, regardless of the economic circumstances. With that said, that is not to say there are not market challenges or implementation challenges, nor is it the case that every state or every market are moving at the same pace. But it's a recognition from a national perspective that we're seeing growth where we would expect to see it. And that certainly these federal investments have helped the industry work through some difficult economic headwinds. So that's it for my time. But thank you so much again for the opportunity and happy to field any questions.
Thank you, Josh.
We have questions.
Commissioner Sakata.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hurwitz, for being here. A couple questions. Number one, where does Maryland rank as a donor or donee state from the federal funds perspective? And second follow-up to that is, how does Maryland obligation of funds compare to other states like Georgia?
That is a good question. It's not something I looked at heading into the presentation, but something I can definitely provide info on, and I'll follow up on that.
Thank you. Yeah. Would you say then, follow to that, would you say, how does Maryland compare to any other state with its obligation of funds this early in the cycle of IIJA?
Again, I should have looked at that. I didn't look in terms of where they're at specifically. I looked at contract awards and a few other things.
Instead.
Question. ARPTA, I know, gets engaged with AASHTO, a lot of different levels, I would assume, just in terms of industry and DOTs. With doubling of funding and doubling of activity on the roads in America as a result of the funding, you know, we have a lot of construction going on and a lot of congestion as a result of it. You know, Maryland's got two of the most congested metropolitan areas in the country, right? So we're always ranking at the top in terms of congestion. What's happened between the industry, ARPTA, and AASHTO in terms of discussing how best to repair the roads and bridges, but minimize congestion and delays? Could you comment on that?
So I would say that from the lens of a humble economist, I'm probably not the best person who can answer those questions and is privy to those conversations in terms of actual implementation. But again, that's something that I can definitely follow up on and bring to the commission, but definitely a great and important question. Thank you.
Commissioner Mohn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point for the group and maybe a perspective from Josh here. Tying in the previous presentation with the, additional EV vehicles on our roadways in the future coming up. Typically, at least with current technology, EVs are 30% heavier than their internal combustion engine counterparts. So that results in more wear and tear on our highways and particularly our bridges, causing for more maintenance in the future, which, obviously with reduced revenues, higher costs for maintenance, has that been considered in any of your perspectives? Or can you comment on that for me, please?
Absolutely. More from the funding side. There's a ton of work going on at the state level in terms of exploring EV fees and exploring relative wear and tear on roads. And actually in the next panel, someone from ARPA who specializes in state funding initiatives will be speaking exactly on these issues. So I'll reserve that for her.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner Flora.
You. Great presentation. The pricing on materials was very interesting in terms of sort of looking at those differentials. Have you looked at labor? I know you said you specifically did not include that in your analysis, but I'm concerned about labor shortages and workers and how do we tie this to overall employment? Because can we keep up with? Because right now we have a backlog of projects that were way overdue with maintenance. So we have the surge of money coming in, a backlog of projects and shortage of labor and materials. So there's a perfect storm here. So to what extent is industry able to actually keep up considering the projects out there?
It's a great question. In terms of tracking labor costs, there is an index that we track as well for workers in the highway and street construction space. That's been up, anywhere from 7 to 10% over the last 2 years. Well, I would say in 21 and 22, and it's eased a bit since then. On the employment side, if you look at changes in employment in recent quarters, for example, last month, the industry added 29,000 new workers, growing at a significantly higher pace than overall construction industry. But the worker shortage is a national issue. That's not just in the current economic environment, but an issue that's been trending for several decades. If you look at things like prime age male labor force participation, certainly an issue over the last few decades. But I would say the industry is doing a good job currently of accommodating some of that supply demand imbalance, and it really differs by state in terms of what the labor market looks like and some of the approaches that are being made to try and improve that situation.
Thank you, Josh. It's great stuff. Wow, and you all this is a timely group. We're hitting the marks. And after we've thrown you all in the deep end of the pool, I think I'm going to need a little time to process all of the conversations we've had today, but a really good start to the discussion. Looking forward to more forthcoming. I think our next meeting is September 13th at 9 a.m. But if others don't have any other questions, or I don't know, Paul, if you have any closing thoughts you want to provide?
Not necessarily closing thoughts, but I think this really just starts to, really open up some of the thinking that we have to do about the future of the trust fund from so many different perspectives, from, achieving other societal goals, when we think about the trust fund, to the drivers that we heard, whether it's the motor fuel tax, whether it's electrical vehicles, how that's going to impact us. And then the current sort of financial crisis being driven by the cost, which we just heard, so I think it's all those things coming together that we've got to keep our eyes on and not look for a quick fix. Which is traditionally, as you've staffed these in the past, where we've gravitated to. I think this is much more complicated than previous committees that we've had like this.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. Looking forward to continuing the conversation, and certainly if there are, things that you need in the intervening time, please don't hesitate to reach out. With that, we are adjourned.